The museum at night does not feel like the museum you entered during the day. The same walls remain, the same corridors extend in quiet continuity, the same objects rest in their assigned places, and yet something subtle has shifted, something that is difficult to name but impossible to ignore. The absence of movement, the absence of voices, the absence of footsteps dissolves the sense that this space exists for you, and in that absence, the architecture begins to emerge in a different way. Not as a background, not as a container for art, but as something that holds its own presence, something that continues to exist and operate even when no one is there to observe it. In daylight, the museum feels animated by people, by attention, by the rhythm of the looking and walking and pausing. But at night, when all of that disappears, what remains is the structure itself, and it becomes clear that the structure was never passive to begin with. There is a tendency to think of architecture as stable and neutral, as something that simply exists to support, to enclose, to provide shelter, or to frame what is inside it. But this assumption depends on distraction. It depends on the presence of activity, on the constant movement of people that prevents you from noticing how the space is shaping that movement in the first place. When the museum becomes still, when there is nothing to follow and nothing to react to, the quiet reveals a different kind of order, one that was always there, but rarely perceived directly, an order that does not demand attention, but instead organizes it, an order that does not speak, but determines how you listen, how you look, how you move without realizing that your movement has already been anticipated. The corridors seem longer, the symmetry becomes more pronounced, the alignment of doorways and arches begins to feel intentional rather than incidental, and the experience of walking through the space transforms into something more controlled, more directed, even though nothing has visibly changed. What is unsettling is not that the space is designed, because that is obvious in a general sense, but that the design extends beyond what is immediately visible, that it operates not only on the level of form and material, but on the level of perception itself. You do not simply move through architecture. Architecture moves you, not physically, but perceptually, guiding your attention, structuring your sense of orientation, influencing what feels natural and what feels disorienting. A corridor that appears straight and balanced encourages a certain pace, a certain confidence in movement, while a space that is irregular or layered, slowing you down, introduces hesitation, invites exploration rather than direction. And yet, these effects are rarely experienced as intentional. They feel like properties of the space rather than decisions embedded within it. And that distinction is what allows architecture to remain invisible, even as it exerts its influence. The museum at night removes the illusion that space is simply there for use, and instead reveals that space has been constructed with an idea of use already in mind, that every axis, every proportion, every alignment participates in a system that anticipates the presence of a viewer, even when that viewer is absent. The stillness does not erase this system, it clarifies it. Without the distraction of people, you begin to notice how your own movement is being guided, how your body aligns with the geometry of the space, how your gaze is drawn towards certain points and away from others, how the architecture creates a sequence of experiences that unfold in a specific order. You do not choose where to look as freely as you might think. Your attention is shaped by the way the space is constructed, by the way light enters and shadows form, by the way openings frame what comes next, by the way scale expands or compresses your sense of presence. It is easy to believe that perception begins with the individual, that you enter a space and then interpret it based on your own awareness, your own preferences, your own intentions, but architecture complicates this belief by introducing a structure that precedes your perception, a structure that organizes the conditions under which perception occurs. The space does not wait to be interpreted. It prepares the interpretation in advance. It creates a framework within which certain experiences feel natural and others feel out of place. And because this framework is not immediately visible as a system, it is often mistaken for neutrality, for the inherent quality of the space, rather than the result of deliberate construction. In the context of the Renaissance, this construction becomes more explicit, not in the sense that it announces itself openly, but in the sense that it is grounded in a set of ideas about order, proportion, and the relationship between the human body and the built environment. The architecture of this period is often described as harmonious, balanced, rational, and these descriptions are not inaccurate, but they are incomplete if they remain at the level of appearance. What matters is not only that the space looks ordered, but that it produces a feeling of order, that it creates a perception of stability and clarity that extends beyond the visual into the way the space is experienced over time. The harmony is not simply seen, it is felt, and that feeling is constructed through a system that connects geometry, proportion, and movement into a coherent whole. To walk through a Renaissance space is to enter into a relationship with that system, whether you are aware of it or not. The proportions of a room, the alignment of architectural elements, the repetition of forms, all contribute to a sense that the space is understandable, that it can be grasped as a whole, that it does not resist comprehension. This sense of clarity is not accidental. It is the result of a deliberate attempt to create an environment in which the viewer feels oriented, centered, and in control of their perception. The space presents itself as stable and intelligible, and in doing so, it encourages a particular way of seeing, one that assumes that the world can be organized, measured, and understood through reason. But this is only one way that architecture can operate, and even within the Renaissance, it is not the only approach that emerges. As we move through different regions and different interpretations of these ideas, the sense of order begins to shift, not disappearing, but transforming into something less immediate, less transparent, more layered. The clarity of geometry gives way to a complexity of surface. The directness of spatial organization becomes intertwined with local traditions, materials, and conditions, and the experience of space becomes less about immediate comprehension and more about gradual discovery. The architecture no longer presents itself as something that can be understood at a glance. It requires movement, attention, and time to reveal its structure. This variation does not contradict the core principles of the Renaissance, but it reveals that those principles can be interpreted in different ways, that the idea of order can manifest as clarity or as complexity, as stability or as variation, depending on how it is applied. What remains constant is the understanding that space is constructed, that it is shaped according to an idea, but the nature of that idea is not fixed, and the experience that results from it is not uniform. The museum, even in its quiet nighttime state, contains traces of these different approaches, these different ways of organizing perception, and as you move through it, you begin to sense that what feels natural in one space may feel entirely different in another, even if the difference is subtle. The longer you remain in this environment, the more difficult it becomes to ignore the fact that your experience is being guided, that the path you take, the way you pause, the way you look, are not entirely self-determined. There is a choreography embedded within the architecture, a sequence of spatial conditions that lead you from one experience to the next, often without interruption, often without resistance. You turn a corner and find yourself aligned with a new axis. You enter a larger space, and your sense of scale shifts. You approach a focal point that has been prepared in advance, and each of these moments feels natural, as though it were the result of your own choices, even though those choices have been shaped by the structure you are moving through. This is where the neutrality of architecture begins to dissolve completely, because it becomes clear that what feels natural is not necessarily what is inherent, but what has been constructed to feel that way. The balance, the symmetry, the proportion, all contribute to a sense of inevitability, a sense that the space could not be otherwise, And yet this inevitability is the result of deliberate design. The architecture does not force you in an obvious way. It persuades you. It aligns your perception with its own logic. And in doing so, it becomes difficult to separate your experience from the structure that produces it. As the night deepens and the museum remains still, this relationship between space and perception becomes more pronounced, not because the architecture has changed, but because your attention has shifted. Without the distractions of the day, you are more aware of how the space unfolds, how each element relates to the next, how the entire environment operates as a system rather than a collection of parts. The walls are no longer just boundaries. The ceilings are no longer just overhead surfaces. The corridors are no longer just passages. They become components of a larger structure that organizes your experience in ways that are both subtle and precise. It is within this awareness that a different way of seeing begins to emerge, one that does not take space for granted, one that recognizes that every aspect of the environment has been shaped according to an idea, whether that idea is immediately visible or not. The museum at night becomes a place where this idea can be felt more clearly, where the absence of activity allows the structure to speak in its own way, not through sound, but through alignment, proportion, and sequence. The silence is not empty. It is filled with the presence of design, with the quiet persistence of a system that continues to operate even when no one is there to engage with it directly. And once this awareness takes hold, it becomes difficult to return to the assumption that space is neutral, that it simply exists as a backdrop for human activity. Instead, you begin to see that space is active, that it participates in the construction of experience, that it shapes not only where you go, but how you understand where you are. The museum is no longer just a place that contains art. It is itself a constructed environment that influences how that art is perceived, how it is approached, how it is remembered. This is where the study of Renaissance architecture begins, not with buildings as isolated objects, not with names and dates and classifications, but with the recognition that space itself is a medium, that it can be designed to produce specific effects, to guide perception in subtle but powerful ways. The Renaissance does not introduce this idea for the first time, but it develops it with a clarity and intention that makes it particularly visible and influential. It creates a framework in which space is no longer just constructed for use, but constructed for experience, for perception, for the shaping of how the world is understood through the body and the senses. And as you move further into this exploration, the question is no longer what architecture looks like, but what it does, how it operates, how it transforms the act of moving through space into something that is both structured and meaningful. The museum at night becomes the beginning of this realization, a moment in which the familiar becomes unfamiliar, in which the background becomes the subject, in which the silent structure reveals itself as something that has been guiding you all along. There is a moment, often so subtle that it resists conscious recognition, when a space aligns itself with perception in such a way that it appears immediately coherent, stable and complete, not as a conclusion, reached through analysis, but as a condition that precedes analysis, a condition that presents itself as self-evident. This immediacy is frequently described as harmony, as balance, as proportion, yet these descriptions do not account for the mechanism by which such impressions are produced. What appears as natural coherence is not inherent to space itself, but emerges from a constructed relationship between form proportion and the perceiving subject, a relationship that has been carefully organized so that its effects are experienced without friction or resistance. The experience of order, therefore, is not the discovery of a property within space, but the result of a system that has been designed to make that property appear inevitable. This inevitability depends on the alignment between geometry and perception, a principle that becomes central to Renaissance architectural thinking and is articulated most explicitly in the writings of Leon Battista Alberti, who defines architecture not merely as the act of building, but as the organization of lineaments, as a system of relationships that precedes material construction. For Alberti, the essence of architecture lies in proportion, in the mathematical coordination of parts that produces a unified whole. And this coordination is not arbitrary, but grounded in the belief that numerical relationships can generate perceptual harmony. The building, in this sense, is not simply an object, but a manifestation of an underlying order that exists independently of its material realization, an order that can be understood intellectually and then translated into spatial form. This intellectualization of space does not emerge in isolation, but draws upon the earlier framework established by Vitruvius, whose triad of firmitas, utilitas, and venustas establishes the foundation for thinking about architecture as a disciplined practice governed by principles rather than intuition alone. Vitruvius introduces the idea that proportion is not merely aesthetic, but structural, that the relationships between parts must correspond to a coherent system that ensures both stability and beauty, and this correspondence becomes a central concern for Renaissance architects, who seek to recover and refine classical principles. However, what distinguishes the Renaissance approach is not simply the adoption of these principles, but their transformation into a perceptual system, one in which proportion is no longer confined to structural necessity, but becomes a means of shaping how space is experienced. The transition from structural proportion to perceptual proportion marks a critical shift, one that redefines the role of architecture in relation to the observer. In a space governed by consistent proportional relationships, the viewer is not required to actively construct coherence. Coherence is presented as already achieved. The alignment of elements, the repetition of ratios, the correspondence between dimensions, all contribute to a condition in which the space can be grasped as a unified whole, even without conscious awareness of the underlying system. This immediacy has been analyzed in depth by Rudolf Wittquer, who demonstrates how Renaissance architecture relies on harmonic ratios derived from musical theory, suggesting that spatial order operates analogously to auditory harmony, producing a resonance that is perceived rather than explicitly calculated. The implication is that proportion functions not only as a mathematical tool, but as a perceptual instrument, one that translates numerical relationships into experiential coherence. This translation from number to perception depends on the assumption that the human subject is capable of recognizing and responding to proportional relationships in a consistent manner, an assumption that aligns with broader Renaissance humanist thought, which positions the human body and mind as measures of the world. The idea that the proportions of architecture should correspond to the proportions of the human body reflects a desire to create a direct relationship between the individual and the environment, a relationship in which space appears to be calibrated to human perception. However, this calibration is not neutral. It establishes a framework within which perception is guided toward a specific experience of order, an experience that feels natural precisely because it has been structured to align with the expected responses of the observer. The role of the observer in this system is not passive, but it is also not autonomous. The space anticipates the presence of the viewer and organizes itself accordingly, positioning the observer within a network of relationships that determine how the environment is perceived. This positioning becomes more explicit when considered alongside the development of a linear perspective, a system that, as analyzed by Erwin Panofsky, establishes a fixed point of view from which space can be understood as a coherent, measurable continuum. Although perspective is often associated with painting, its logic extends into architecture, where it informs the arrangement of space in relation to the viewer, reinforcing the idea that perception is not arbitrary, but structured according to a predetermined system. In this context, the experience of order becomes inseparable from the positioning of the observer, because the clarity of the space depends on the alignment between the viewer's point of view and the geometry of the environment. The space appears coherent, not because it is inherently so, but because it has been constructed to produce coherence from a specific perspective. This construction introduces a subtle form of control, one that operates not through restriction, but through alignment, guiding perception in a way that feels intuitive rather than imposed. The viewer is not forced into a particular position, but the space encourages certain positions over others, creating a hierarchy of viewpoints that correspond to the intended experience of order. This relationship between space and control can be further understood through the theoretical framework of Michel Foucault, who examines how spatial organization functions as a means of structuring behavior and perception. Although Foucault's analysis focuses on later architectural forms, the underlying principle that space can operate as a mechanism of control is already present in Renaissance architecture, where the arrangement of elements directs movement, organizes attention, and establishes a sense of orientation that limits the range of possible interpretations. The ordered space does not constrain through visible barriers. It constrains through coherence, through the elimination of ambiguity, through the creation of an environment in which a deviation from the intended experience becomes less likely. This elimination of ambiguity is central to the feeling of order, because it reduces the cognitive effort required to navigate the space, allowing perception to proceed without interruption. In an environment where relationships are consistent and predictable, the observer does not need to question or reinterpret the space at every moment. The structure provides a continuous framework that supports a stable experience. This stability is often associated with comfort, with a sense of ease, but it also has the effect of reinforcing the authority of the space, of presenting its organization as natural and unquestionable. The coherence of the environment becomes a form of persuasion, not through explicit argument, but through the consistency of its structure. At the same time, this persuasion depends on the invisibility of the system that produces it. If the mechanisms of the order were immediately apparent, if the proportional relationships and geometric alignments were perceived as imposed rather than inherent, the experience of naturalness would be disrupted. The success of Renaissance architectural order lies in its ability to conceal its own construction, to present itself as a direct reflection of an underlying reality, rather than as a system that has been designed to produce that impression. The viewer does not perceive the ratios or the alignments. The viewer perceives the effect of those ratios and alignments as a unified condition. This concealment raises a fundamental question about the nature of architectural experience, because it suggests that what is perceived as natural may in fact be the result of a highly structured system that operates beyond conscious awareness. The feeling of order, therefore, is not evidence of an inherent property of space, but an indication of the effectiveness of the system that produces it. The space appears to be self-evident, but this self-evidence is constructed, and its construction depends on the precise coordination of elements that align geometry, proportion, and perception into a coherent whole. As you move through such a space, particularly in the quiet stillness of the museum at night, this coordination becomes more apparent, not as a set of explicit rules, but as a condition that shapes your experience at every moment. The alignment of corridors, the rhythm of architectural elements, the continuity of proportions, all contribute to a sense that the space unfolds according to a logic that is both consistent and invisible. You do not need to analyze this logic in order to experience it. It operates continuously, guiding your movement, stabilizing your perception, creating a framework within which the environment can be understood without effort. This effortlessness is not accidental. It is the result of a deliberate attempt to construct a space that aligns with the expected patterns of perception that reduces variability and uncertainty, that presents itself as coherent from multiple perspectives while maintaining a consistent internal structure. The space does not adapt to the observer. It anticipates the observer, creating conditions that encourage a specific mode of engagement. The viewer, in turn, experiences this alignment as natural, as though the space were responding to their presence rather than guiding it. And it is within this reciprocal relationship between space and perception that the concept of order takes on its full significance, not as a static quality, but as a dynamic condition that emerges through the interaction between the built environment and the observer. The order is not located in the objects themselves, nor is it entirely within the perception of the viewer. It exists in the relationship between the two, in the way that the structure of the space organizes the conditions under which perception occurs. The museum at night, stripped of its daytime distractions, reveals this relationship with a clarity that is difficult to achieve in more active environments. Without the movement of people, without the shifting focus of attention, the architecture becomes more present, more perceptible as a system that operates independently of immediate use. The stillness allows the structure to emerge, not as an object to be observed, but as a condition that shapes observation itself. The space no longer recedes into the background. It becomes the medium through which experience is constructed. And once this shift in perception occurs, once the sense of order is recognized as a constructed effect, rather than an inherent property, it becomes impossible to return to the assumption that space is neutral, that it simply exists without influencing how it is perceived. Instead, the space reveals itself as active, as participatory, as a system that shapes not only what is seen, but how it is understood. The feeling of calm, of clarity, of balance is no longer taken for granted. It is recognized as the result of a specific way of organizing space, a way that has been developed, refined, and applied with the intention of producing a particular experience. This recognition does not diminish the power of the experience, but it transforms it, shifting it from something that is passively received to something that can be actively understood, analyzed, and interpreted. The ordered space remains compelling, but its coherence is no longer seen as inevitable. It is seen as constructed, as the outcome of a system that aligns geometry, proportion, and perception into a unified whole. And it is within this understanding that the exploration of Renaissance architecture continues, moving beyond the appearance of order to examine the mechanisms by which that order is produced, sustained, and experienced. The sense of order that characterizes Renaissance architecture emerges through a reconstruction of antiquity that is neither direct recovery nor simple imitation, but a critical reassembly of texts, ruins, measurements, and images into a system capable of organizing perception. The classical world functions less as a stable origin than as a field of fragments requiring interpretation. The act of rediscovery is therefore methodological. It establishes procedures for reading, measuring, comparing, and translating ancient material into a coherent framework. What is produced is not antiquity itself, but a Renaissance model of antiquity, selective, codified, and oriented toward perceptual clarity. The recovery of Vitruvius provides the initial scaffolding for this reconstruction. De Architectura offers a language in which architecture can be described as a discipline governed by ratio, proportion, and decorum. Yet the text is incomplete, technically uneven, and often ambiguous. Its authority lies not in exhaustive instruction, but in its assertion that architecture possesses principles that can be articulated and learned. Renaissance readers transform this assertion into a program. They extract proportional schemes, systematize orders, and correlate textual descriptions with observed remains. The Vitruvian body, used as a proportional template, becomes a diagrammatic bridge between geometry and perception, asserting commensurability between the human figure and the built environment. The body is not only a measure, it is a model for organizing relations so that space appears intelligible. Humanist philology intensifies this process. The circulation of manuscripts, the correction of corrupt passages, and the comparison of variants introduce a critical attitude towards sources. Architecture enters the same epistemic regime as classical texts. It becomes an object of scholarship. The architect is repositioned as an interpreter who negotiates between evidence and hypothesis. This interpretive labor extends to the ruins themselves, which are surveyed, drawn, and measured. The fragment becomes a site of inference. Missing parts are reconstructed through proportional reasoning, analogies across buildings, and geometric extrapolation. The resulting images, plans, elevations, sections, do not merely record, they synthesize. They stabilize conjecture into visual form, enabling transmission and replication. Within this context, Filippo Brunelleschi operates as a pivotal figure who converts observational practice into a system of spatial control. His studies of Roman monuments, combined with his experiments in linear perspective, produce a framework in which space can be organized relative to a fixed viewpoint. Perspective is not confined to pictorial representation. It establishes a discipline of alignment, axis, and convergence that informs architectural composition. The viewer is positioned within a field whose coherence depends on the calibration of lines and intervals. Space becomes legible because it is constructed to correspond with the conditions of vision. The apparent naturalness of ordered space derives from this correspondence. The theoretical articulation of this correspondence is developed by Leon Battista Alberti, whose De Re Edificatoria redefines architecture as the design of lineaments, abstract relationships that precede material execution. Alberti's emphasis on consinitas, fittingness or harmony, specifies that beauty results from the precise agreement of parts within a whole, governed by number and proportion. This agreement is not subjective. It is produced through calculable relations. Alberti's project is epistemic, to render architecture a domain in which knowledge can be formalized, transmitted, and verified. The building becomes a realization of a prior order that can be conceived independently of construction. The distinction between design and execution secures the autonomy of the system. The system acquires further clarity through the codification of the architectural orders. Treatises by figures such as Sebastiano Serlio and Giacomo Barozzi da Vignola standardize columnar proportions, entablatures, and decorative sequences into reproducible modules. The orders function as a grammar, a set of rules that govern combination and variation. Their dissemination, through printed books, converts local practices into trans-regional conventions. Print technology stabilizes diagrams, fixes ratios, and enables consistent replication. The architect operates within a shared language, reducing ambiguity and increasing predictability. The effect on perception is direct. Repetition and regularity produce legibility. Legibility produces the experience of order. This codification intersects with a broader transformation in knowledge, described by Michel Foucault as the emergence of systems of classification and ordering. Architecture participates in this transformation by organizing space according to principles that render it analyzable and controllable. The grid, the module, and the axis are not only compositional devices, they are instruments that structure behavior and perception. The building becomes a diagram of relations. Movement is anticipated through sequences, attention is directed through alignments. Hierarchy is established through scale and position. The ordered environment reduces indeterminacy by narrowing the range of possible readings. The relationship between geometry and perception is further illuminated by Erwin Panofsky, whose analysis of perspective identifies it as a symbolic form that structures the field of vision. Perspective does not simply depict space. It constructs a regime in which space is measurable, continuous, and centered on the observer. When this regime informs architecture, it produces environments that are comprehensible from designated viewpoints. The apparent immediacy of understanding is an effect of this construction. The viewer recognizes coherence because the space has been organized to correspond with the logic of projection. The proportional system acquires a specific harmonic dimension in the work analyzed by Rudolf Wittker, who demonstrates that Renaissance architects employ ratios analogous to musical consonances. The octave fifth and fourth become spatial intervals translated into dimensions of rooms and relationships between parts. This analogy does not imply a direct auditory experience. It establishes a model in which numerical harmony produces perceptual agreement. The building resonates as a coherent whole because its parts are related through consistent ratios. The translation from number to perception operates without explicit awareness. The observer experiences unity as a given. The integration of these principles is not uniform. It is mediated by sight, material, patronage, and program. Yet the underlying commitment to system remains. Buildings are conceived as totalitiers in which each element participates in a network of relations. Plans are organized around central or axial schemes. Elevations articulate proportional sequences. Interiors align volumes with structural rhythms. The dome, revived and transformed, exemplifies this integration by unifying geometry, structure, and perception into a single figure that stabilizes the spatial field. The dome's curvature and centralized form produce a focal condition that anchors the viewer's orientation. The process of measurement becomes central to this integration. Surveying techniques, proportional diagrams, and modular grids convert empirical observation into calculable data. Drawings serve as instruments of analysis and design, enabling the manipulation of relationships prior to construction. The plan, section, and elevation operate as coordinated projections that maintain consistency across different views. This consistency ensures that the built result corresponds to the conceptual system. The drawing is not auxiliary. It is constitutive of the architectural process. The role of patronage shapes the application of these systems. Civic authorities, ecclesiastical institutions, and elite families commission buildings that embody order as a visible expression of authority and legitimacy. The ordered facade, the regularized courtyard, and the symmetrical plan communicate stability and control. Architecture functions as a medium of representation in which political and social structures are translated into spatial form. The legibility of the system supports its persuasive function. Coherence is read as necessity, necessity as authority. The adaptation of classical principles to contemporary conditions introduces constraints that reveal the limits of the system. Urban fabrics impose irregular plots. Existing structures require integration. Material limitations affect execution. Architects negotiate these constraints by adjusting proportions, introducing compensations, and prioritizing key relationships. The ideal is maintained through strategic emphasis rather than exhaustive application. The result is a calibrated coherence that tolerates local variation while preserving overall legibility. The encounter with antiquity extends beyond Italy through networks of travel, correspondence, and print. As classical principles circulate, they intersect with regional traditions, producing differentiated interpretations. The system demonstrates flexibility. It can be applied to diverse programs and contexts while maintaining recognizable features. This adaptability contributes to its durability. The rediscovered classical world becomes a transferable framework rather than a fixed repertoire. The epistemic status of architecture shifts accordingly. It becomes a field in which knowledge is produced through the coordination of text, image, and built form. Treatises articulate principles, drawings visualize relationships, buildings instantiate systems. Each medium reinforces the others. The authority of architecture derives from this triangulation. The coherence of the system is validated across representations and realizations. The perceptual consequences of this shift are cumulative. The observer encounters environments that present themselves as immediately intelligible, in which the relationships between parts are consistent and predictable. Orientation is stabilized, movement is guided, attention is directed. The experience of order is continuous because the system operates at multiple scales, from the spacing of columns to the proportions of rooms to the alignment of entire complexes. The same logic recurs. Repetition reinforces recognition. Recognition reinforces coherence. The invisibility of the system is essential to its effectiveness. Proportional ratios are not perceived as numbers. They are perceived as agreement. Alignments are not read as constructions. They are read as natural continuities. The system withdraws behind its effects. This withdrawal distinguishes Renaissance order from explicit ornament or symbolic coding. Meaning is embedded in relations rather than surfaces. The building communicates through structure rather than inscription. The reconstruction of antiquity therefore produces a dual outcome, a codified language of forms and a perceptual regime that organizes experience. The language provides tools. The regime provides effects. The two are inseparable. Columns, arches, and domes are not merely references. They are components within a system that aligns geometry with perception. Their repetition across buildings reinforces the stability of the system and its capacity to generate consistent experiences. The museum environment concentrates these dynamics. As a curated sequence of spaces, it stages variations within a shared framework. The visitor encounters shifts in scale, proportion, and alignment that reveal the system's adaptability. In the absence of daytime activity, these shifts become more legible. The continuity of order persists across transitions, even as specific configurations change. The museum functions as an index of the system's operations. The rediscovery of the classical world thus establishes conditions under which architecture can be conceived as a medium of controlled perception. The system integrates textual authority, empirical observation, geometric reasoning, and representational techniques into a coherent practice. The resulting environments produce a stable experience of order that appears self-evident. This appearance depends on the alignment between constructed relations and perceptual expectations. The system does not eliminate complexity. It organizes it into a form that can be apprehended without interruption. The implications extend beyond individual buildings. Urban planning adopts axial alignments, regulated facades, and coordinated scales to produce legible cityscapes. Public spaces are framed to direct movement and attention. The city becomes an extension of the architectural system, operating at a larger scale. The same principles that organize a room organize a street or a square. The experience of order becomes spatially continuous. The persistence of this system depends on its capacity to be taught, replicated, and adapted. Treatises provide instruction, drawings provide templates, built examples provide models. Apprenticeship and practice transmit techniques. The system stabilizes across generations. Its authority is reinforced by its success in producing environments that are experienced as coherent and reliable. The reconstruction of antiquity remains selective. Elements that support the system are emphasized, others are minimized or excluded. The classical world is filtered through criteria of clarity, proportion, and legibility. This filtering is constitutive of the Renaissance project. It produces a version of antiquity that aligns with contemporary aims. The past is organized to serve the present. The relationship between system and perception remains central. The experience of order is not a byproduct, It is the objective. Geometry, proportion, and alignment are means toward this end. The building operates as a device that converts abstract relations into perceptual effects. The success of the device is measured by the continuity and stability of those effects. Within this framework, deviations acquire significance. Irregularities, asymmetries, and local adaptations become legible as departures from the system. They are perceived against the background of order. This contrast reinforces the system's presence. The expectation of coherence heightens sensitivity to variation. The system defines the terms under which difference is recognized. The rediscovery of the classical world therefore establishes a discipline in which architecture is conceived as the construction of perceptual order through codified relations. The discipline integrates knowledge and practice, representation and realization, past and present. It produces environments that guide movement, organize attention, and stabilize orientation. The experience of order is achieved through the precise coordination of elements within a system that remains largely invisible to the observer. The museum at night reveals this coordination by removing competing stimuli, allowing the structure to emerge as the primary agent shaping perception. The reconstruction of antiquity produces a shared vocabulary, but it does not produce a unified system of space. The principles derived from the classical world, proportion, symmetry, the orders, axiality, and geometric clarity, are not applied uniformly. They are translated, negotiated, and reconfigured within different cultural, material, and intellectual contexts. What emerges is not a singular Renaissance architecture, but multiple regimes of order, each grounded in the same theoretical inheritance, yet diverging in how that inheritance is operationalized. The distinction between Italy and Northern Europe is therefore not a matter of stylistic variation. It is a difference in how space is constructed as a perceptual system, how coherence is produced, and how the observer is positioned within that coherence. In the Italian context, the engagement with antiquity consolidates into a system that prioritizes the immediate legibility of space. Classical principles are not merely referenced, they are systematized and made explicit. The orders function as a grammar, proportion operates as a regulating mechanism, and geometry is expressed as a visible structure that organizes the entire composition. The result is an architecture in which the relationships between parts are not only consistent but perceptible at once, allowing the observer to grasp the whole without requiring extended movement or interpretation. This emphasis on immediate intelligibility corresponds to the theoretical framework articulated by Leon Battista Alberti, whose concept of consinitas defines beauty as the agreement of parts within a unified system, governed by numerical proportion. Alberti's formulation is not descriptive but prescriptive. It establishes a criterion for design in which coherence is achieved through measurable relationships, and this measurability becomes the basis for perceptual clarity. The building is conceived as an abstract system before it is realized materially, and the success of that system depends on the precision with which its relationships are maintained. The observer does not encounter a collection of elements. The observer encounters a structure in which each element is integrated into a network of proportional relations that produce a unified effect. The experience of order is therefore not incidental. It is the direct consequence of a system that has been designed to produce it. This system is reinforced by the codification of classical forms in architectural treatises, particularly those by Sebastiano Zerlio and Giacomo Barozzi da Vignola, which translate the variability of ancient examples into standardized modules. The orders are reduced to sets of ratios that can be reproduced consistently, ensuring that buildings constructed in different contexts maintain a recognizable coherence. This standardization reduces ambiguity and stabilizes perception because it limits the range of variation and reinforces the repetition of familiar relationships. The observer encounters a system that is predictable, and this predictability produces a sense of confidence, a perception that the space is structured according to a logic that can be trusted. The perceptual consequences of this system are closely aligned with the perspective paradigm analyzed by Erwin Panofsky, in which space is constructed as a homogeneous, measurable continuum organized around a fixed viewpoint. Although perspective is often associated with painting, its logic informs architectural composition, particularly in the use of axial planning and centralized forms. Buildings, such as the Tempietto, by Donato Bramante, demonstrate how a centralized plan can produce a complete and immediate understanding of space. The circular colonnade, the proportional relationship between the drum and dome, and the symmetry of the composition create an environment in which the observer perceives the entire structure as a unified whole. There is no need for movement to reveal the system. The system is already visible. A similar clarity is evident in the interior of Basilica of San Lorenzo by Filippo Brunelleschi, where the spacing of columns, the height of arches, and the articulation of entablatures are coordinated according to a consistent proportional scheme. The observer encounters a rhythm that is regular and predictable, a sequence of elements that reinforce the coherence of the space at every point. The geometry is not concealed, it is expressed, and this expression ensures that the structure of the space can be perceived without effort. The harmonic dimension of this proportional system, as analyzed by Rudolf Wittkehr, further clarifies how numerical relationships translate into perceptual effects. Ratios derived from musical consonances structure spatial relationships, producing a sense of agreement that is experienced rather than calculated. The observer does not consciously recognize these ratios, but their consistency generates a perception of unity that extends throughout the building. The space resonates as a coherent whole because its parts are related through a system that maintains proportional consistency across scales. This consistency extends to the sequencing of space. Entrances align with axes, thresholds, frame views, and transitions between volumes are calibrated to maintain continuity. The observer moves through a sequence that confirms the underlying system at each stage, reinforcing the perception of order. The interior of St. Peter's Basilica exemplifies this principle at a monumental scale, where axial alignment and hierarchical proportion ensure that even vast spaces remain legible. The observer's movement does not produce understanding. It confirms an understanding that is already present. In contrast, the architectural developments of Northern Europe engage with the same classical vocabulary, but produce a different perceptual regime. Classical elements are introduced into contexts shaped by Gothic traditions, local construction practices, and material constraints, resulting in a system in which order is not eliminated, but redistributed. Geometry remains present, but it is not always expressed with the same clarity or consistency. The observer does not encounter a space that can be grasped at once. Instead, understanding emerges through movement, through the accumulation of experiences that reveal the structure gradually. This difference can be understood through the persistence of Gothic spatial logic, which emphasizes verticality, articulation, and the layering of elements. When classical forms are integrated into this framework, they do not replace it, they interact with it, producing hybrid compositions that resist immediate synthesis. The facade of the Antwerp City Hall, for example, incorporates classical symmetry and orders, but the surface is highly articulated, with decorative elements that introduce variation and complexity. The observer perceives order, but that order is mediated by detail, by a surface that requires attention and interpretation. The Château de Chambord provides a more complex example where the integration of classical and local elements produces a structure that cannot be understood from a single viewpoint. The central staircase, often associated with the influence of Leonardo da Vinci, creates a spatial experience that unfolds through movement. The double helix configuration allows multiple paths to intersect without merging, producing a dynamic interaction between occupants and space. The building does not present itself as a resolved system. It reveals its structure through engagement. Material conditions reinforce this complexity. The use of brick, timber, and regional stone introduces textures that fragment the surface, producing variations in light and shadow that alter the perception of form. The facade of Heidelberg Castle demonstrates how classical elements can coexist with irregular massing and layered ornamentation, creating a composition that cannot be reduced to a single proportional system. The observer must navigate these variations, constructing coherence through movement rather than receiving it immediately. The perceptual structure of Northern Renaissance architecture aligns with the phenomenological framework articulated by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in which perception is understood as embodied and temporal. Space is not given as a complete object. It is constituted through the interaction between the observer and the environment. The observer does not occupy a fixed viewpoint. The observer moves, and this movement produces a sequence of perceptions that gradually reveal the structure of the space. Order is not absent. It is experienced over time. This temporal dimension is further shaped by urban conditions, which impose constraints that prevent the application of centralized or strictly axial plans. Buildings are adapted to irregular plots, integrated into existing fabrics, and modified over time, resulting in compositions that reflect accumulation rather than resolution. The El Escorial represents a different variation, where large-scale geometry is present, but unfolds through a sequence of courtyards and corridors that require movement to be understood. The observer does not perceive the entire structure at once. The experience is constructed through progression. The divergence between Italy and the North can therefore be understood as a difference in how order is distributed. In the Italian system, order is concentrated at the level of the whole and presented immediately. In the Northern system, order is distributed across parts and revealed through sequence. The first produces a perception of stability and clarity. The second produces a perception of complexity and depth. Both rely on the same principles, but they apply them differently, resulting in distinct perceptual experiences. This distinction reflects broader differences in intellectual and cultural contexts. The Italian emphasis on humanist ideals, on the capacity of reason to organize the world, supports an architecture that seeks to present order as something that can be fully grasped. The Northern context, shaped by different traditions and conditions, produces an architecture that acknowledges variability, that accommodates complexity, that allows for a more open-ended relationship between the observer and the environment. These differences do not represent opposing positions, but alternative interpretations of how order can be constructed. The theoretical implications of this divergence extend beyond the Renaissance. They reveal that architecture does not simply reflect a pre-existing order. It produces order through the organization of relationships. The same principles can generate different perceptual regimes, depending on how they are applied. Order is not a fixed property. It is an effect, a condition that emerges from the interaction between geometry, material, and perception. As you move through the museum, this divergence becomes perceptible not as a historical distinction, but as an experiential one. Some spaces present themselves as immediately coherent, aligning your perception with a system that requires no interpretation. Others unfold gradually, requiring movement, attention, and time to reveal their structure. The contrast is not visual alone. It is temporal, cognitive, and embodied. This awareness transforms the way space is perceived. The clarity of one environment, the complexity of another, are no longer taken for granted. They are recognized as outcomes of specific decisions about how space should be constructed. The architecture reveals itself as a system, or rather as multiple systems, each operating according to its own logic, each shaping perception in its own way. And within this recognition, the distinction between Italy and the North becomes more than a comparison. It becomes a framework for understanding how architecture constructs reality. It reveals that space is not neutral, that it is always organized according to principles that guide perception, that these principles can be applied in different ways, producing different experiences of order. The Renaissance, therefore, is not a single vision, but a multiplicity of visions, each demonstrating that order itself is not given, but made. The architect of the Renaissance does not arrive fully formed. He emerges through conflict, ambition, study, rivalry, patronage, and the gradual separation of design from construction. In the medieval building world, the master builder possessed authority because he knew how to make a structure rise, how to coordinate stone, timber, mortar, scaffolding, labor, and site conditions. His knowledge was practical and embodied. It was transmitted through workshops and lodge systems, not primarily through books. The Renaissance changes this by creating a figure whose authority depends increasingly on drawing, theory, geometry, antiquarian study, and the power to conceive a complete work before labor begins. This is the deeper historical meaning of the Renaissance architect. He is not only more learned than the master builder, he is structurally different. He stands at a new distance from the building, and that distance gives him power. He can imagine the whole before the whole exists. He can dictate proportion before a foundation is dug. He can impose order on craft. He can move from one patron to another carrying not only skill, but a system. This shift is visible in the careers of Brunelleschi, Alberti, Bramante, Giuliano da Sangallo, Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, Serlio, Raphael, and Palladio. Their lives differ sharply, but together they show how architecture was redefined from a material practice into an intellectual discipline. Alberti's reverence for Roman architecture, his use of Vitruvius, and the rise of theory as a handbook for artists and architects are central to this transition, while later architects such as Palladio turned their designs into repeatable and teachable models through print. Filippo Brunelleschi stands at the beginning because his life already contains the fracture between the older world and the new. He was trained as a goldsmith, not as an architect in the modern sense, and that fact matters because goldsmith training demanded exactness, controlled fabrication, mechanical intelligence, and close familiarity with making. He entered the famous 1401 competition for the bronze doors of the Florence Baptistery and lost to Lorenzo Ghiberti, an episode that later tradition treated almost like a founding drama of Renaissance rivalry. Britannica notes the long association of that loss with Brunelleschi's departure from Florence and his turn toward Rome. Whether every later anecdote is reliable, the broader trajectory is clear. He studied ancient Roman remains, especially domed and vaulted structures, not as picturesque ruins, but as technical and proportional systems that could be measured and rethought. He returned to Florence with a mind altered by antiquity and with a conception of architecture that was no longer primarily imitative. He had become interested in principles. His fame rests, above all, on the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, constructed from 1420 to 1436 with machines he designed for the work. But the dome should not be reduced to a feat of engineering. It is also the moment when the architect demonstrates that he can solve a problem by inventing an entire method. The brick pattern, the hoisting devices, the structural logic, and the refusal of conventional centering together reveal an architect who governs building through prior conception. Brunelleschi is equally important for the spaces he made after the dome. In the old sacristy of San Lorenzo, in the Basilica of San Lorenzo, and in Santo Spirito, he developed interiors governed by modules, clear bays, rational intervals, and a new relation between geometry and bodily comprehension. The observer does not wander in those interiors searching for order. Order is immediately given. Brunelleschi is also traditionally credited with the practical demonstration of linear perspective, and whether or not every technical aspect can be assigned to him alone, Alberti later treated perspective as a formalizable system that had already been opened by Brunelleschi's experiments. His life, therefore, unites craft training, bitter competition, antiquarian study, engineering invention, and perceptual reorganization. He does not merely build. He establishes the possibility that architecture can be conceived as a total system. Leon Battista Alberti is the necessary counterpart to Brunelleschi because he gives explicit language to what Brunelleschi embodied in practice. Alberti's life is unlike Brunelleschi's. Britannica describes him as a humanist, architect, an initiator of Renaissance art theory, the prototype of the universal man. That description is not rhetorical excess. Alberti was educated in the literary and intellectual culture of humanism. He wrote on painting, family life, ethics, mathematics, and cryptography. He was not first trained in a building workshop, and this distance from craft gave him a different kind of authority. He could conceptualize architecture from the standpoint of theory, writing, and abstraction. In De Re Edificatoria, he treats architecture as a discipline whose essence lies in lineaments, the formal relations, that can be conceived independently of matter. That distinction is one of the decisive moments in the history of architecture, because it makes the design logically prior to the construction. The building becomes the embodiment of a conceptual order that exists before materials are assembled. Alberti's own works reveal how theory does not remain detached from practice. The facade of Santa Maria Novella in Florence completed an existing Gothic church by imposing a proportional and geometric coherence across unequally inherited parts. The facade of Palazzo Rucellai translated the language of the classical orders into an urban palace front, creating a measured and layered exterior that associated private family identity with antique civic dignity. At Rimini, he transformed San Francesco into what became known as the Tempio Malatestiano, an unfinished and deeply revealing project in which triumphal arch motifs and antique forms were used to monumentalize the ambitions of Sigismondo Malatesta. At Mantua he designed Sant'Andrea, begun in 1472, the year of his death, a church that became one of the most influential Renaissance interiors because it fused the Roman triumphal arch motif with a vast barrel-vaulted nave and side chapels integrated into a rational whole. Sant'Andrea matters in this chapter, not only because it is a masterpiece, but because it dramatizes the relation between completed and incomplete authorship. Alberti conceived it, but it began after his death. The architect's mind outlives the architect's body. The project confirms that architecture had become something transmissible through drawing, writing, and system. Alberti also addressed Brunelleschi in a famous dedicatory letter attached to De Pictura, and modern scholarship has read that letter as part admiration and part reflection on artistic genius, ambition, and the moral stakes of technical mastery. Alberti's life and works therefore show the architect becoming a theorist of order, someone who can convert the prestige of antiquity into a codified method, and then turn that method back into built space. Donato Bramante carries the story forward by intensifying the architect's role as author of spatial totality. Britannica describes him not only as an architect, but also as a perspectivist painter, and that double identity is crucial. His early training in painting and perspective meant that he approached architecture as something that could command the eye as well as the body. At Santa Maria presso San Satiro in Milan, one of his early architectural masterpieces, a severe site limitation made it impossible to build a full choir behind the crossing. Bramante responded by constructing a perspectival illusion that makes the space appear deeper than it is. This is a small but decisive story, because it shows the architect using visual intelligence to overcome material constraint. He does not surrender to the site. He reconstructs perception itself. After moving to Rome in 1499, he entered the city that had transformed Brunelleschi and made it his own field of study and invention. His monastery and cloister at Santa Maria della Pace, and above all the Tempietto at San Pietro in Montorio, became models of Roman high Renaissance clarity. The Tempietto, commissioned by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain around 1502 on the supposed site of St. Peter's martyrdom, compressed the authority of antique form into a small centralized shrine whose circular colonnade, proportional drum, and lucid geometry made it appear simultaneously exact and inevitable. The building is tiny in scale, yet enormous in historical consequence, because it demonstrates that a centralized plan could become the emblem of ideal architecture. Bramante then carried this ambition into the greatest unfinished and reworked project of the age, St. Peter's Basilica. Appointed chief architect when the new basilica began in 1506, he proposed a vast centralized scheme that sought to give the church a spatial form equal to its universal claims. The final basilica would be altered repeatedly after his death in 1514, but Bramante's role remains foundational because he framed the problem in terms of geometric totality. His Belvedere court at the Vatican, also begun in Rome, used terraces, axial sequencing, and an unprecedented large-scale composition to bind separate papal buildings into a single ordered complex. Bramante's life, therefore, shows the architect moving beyond the single church or palace into the domain of institutional and urban systems. He becomes a designer of spatial ideology. Even his incomplete works are significant because they reveal the architect's expanding horizon. The project becomes larger than any one life, yet still bears the signature of the system its first author conceived. Giuliano da Sangallo represents a different but equally important formation of the Renaissance architect, one in which technical versatility, court service, military knowledge, and classicizing clarity converge. Britannica identifies him as architect, sculptor, and military engineer, and that combination is revealing because it shows how broad the architect's competencies had become. Giuliano worked for the Medici and became one of the most trusted designers in their orbit. His Church of Santa Maria delle Carceri in Prato, built from 1485 to 1491, is singled out by Britannica as the purest and most classic expression of the Brunelleschian central plan legacy in the 15th century. The Greek cross plan is not merely formal. It is the visible assertion of a mind that understands geometry as the basis of architectural clarity. Yet Giuliano's career also demonstrates that Renaissance architecture was embedded in the life of patrons and dynasties. Lorenzo de' Medici commissioned him for the Villa Medici at Poggio a Caiano, a project of immense importance because it helped define the Renaissance villa as something other than a rural fortress or simple country house. It opened the villa toward the landscape and gave agrarian territory an ordered classical face. The project was not straightforwardly completed in one campaign. Work halted after Lorenzo's death in 1492 and the Medici exile, and later phases altered or extended the original design. This incomplete and interrupted history matters because it reveals how patronage and politics shaped the architect's fate. Giuliano's design outlived its initial political world, and the villa became a layered object that preserved his conceptual breakthrough even as history delayed and transformed its completion. Giuliano also made important surveys and drawings of ancient Roman ruins, a practice that connects him directly to the antiquarian habits of the new architect. He was not content to inherit form. He studied its remnants, measured them, and translated them into future design. In him, the architect becomes not only a designer, but also an archaeologist of principles. Antonio da Sangallo the younger deepens the story by revealing the architect as organizer of complexity, manager of major commissions, and author of systems that are often known as much through drawings and models as through finished buildings. Britannica calls him the most influential architect of his time, and the phrase is justified by the scale of his commissions and the intensity of his involvement in papal Rome. He came to Rome young, worked first in the orbit of his uncles, and then under Bramante, and rose through practical skill, especially as a draftsman and problem solver. His early life, as summarized in the broader Sangallo family tradition, was not marked by ease or elite humanist polish. He developed through labor, carpentry, design, and the discipline of construction. This background matters because Antonio joins the practical intelligence of the builder to the representational mastery of the new architect. His career at Palazzo Farnese is central. The palace began as a house for Cardinal Alessandro Farnese in 1513 and expanded dramatically after Alessandro became Pope Paul III. Antonio transformed it into one of the great palaces of Rome, a work of massive urban dignity. Yet Palazzo Farnese is also a story of incompletion and succession. Antonio died in 1546, before the palace was fully resolved, and later interventions altered its upper cornice and aspects of its final appearance. The project demonstrates again that Renaissance architecture often exceeds the life of its architect, while retaining the force of his ordering intelligence. Antonio was also deeply involved with St. Peter's, where he inherited the burden of working after Bramante and before later redesigns. His giant wooden model for St. Peter's became famous as an instrument of architectural control and persuasion. Even where his scheme was not ultimately realized, it testifies to the architect's new power to embody a future building in a detailed representational object. Antonio's work on difficult foundations and reinforcements, especially at sites where unstable ground or previous structural weakness threatened the building, shows another side of the Renaissance architect. He is not only the author of ideal plans, he is the one who makes form stand against reality. He must deal with rivers, bad soil, cracked vaults, inherited mistakes, insufficient funds, and changing papal priorities. The architect's grandeur is inseparable from this practical battlefield. Raphael deserves inclusion here not because he replaces Michelangelo in your narrative, but because he reveals how porous the boundary remained between painter and architect during the High Renaissance. Britannica notes that while still at work on the Vatican stands, Raphael began doing architectural commissions in Rome, including Sant'Eligio degli Orefici, the Chigi Chapel, and later work connected with St. Peter's, after Bramante's death. His architectural career was cut short by his early death in 1520, but its importance lies precisely in its incompleteness. Raphael's life shows a gifted visual intelligence, moving into architecture at the moment when architecture had become the highest arena of spatial authorship in papal Rome. His design for the Chigi Chapel created what Britannica calls a miniature church within a chapel, a compressed sacred architecture that demonstrates how centralized planning and symbolic concentration could operate at small scale. His Villa Madama project, begun in 1518, became one of the most famous unfinished villas of the Renaissance. It was conceived on a grand scale for Cardinal Giulio de' Medici and sought to integrate ancient Roman villa imagery, ceremonial approach, terraced landscape, and richly orchestrated architecture into one environment. Its incompleteness is historically meaningful because it reveals how the architect's ambition had expanded to encompass entire worlds of experience, not just discrete buildings. Raphael's short architectural life also illustrates the growing prestige of the architect in the service of elite patrons. He moved from image maker to spatial strategist, from painter of papal rooms to designer of chapels, villas, and basilicas. That movement itself marks the changed cultural status of architecture. Sebastiano Serlio takes the story in a different direction by showing that an architect can transform the discipline not only through buildings, but through books. Britannica identifies him as architect, painter, and theorist, while Oxford and the Oxford Collections material stress the enormous influence of his architectural publications in systematizing the classical orders and spreading a scholarly engagement with Vitruvius and antiquity. Serlio was first trained as a painter in Bologna, moved to Rome where he studied architecture with Baldassare Peruzzi and absorbed the city's ruins, then fled the sack of Rome in 1527, later working in Venice and eventually in France under Francis I. His life is therefore also a story of displacement, transmission, and migration. He carries Roman architectural knowledge across political rupture and geographical distance. His 7 books on architecture, published over decades, matter because they turn architecture into reproducible knowledge. They do not merely describe buildings. They present architecture as a teachable system of orders, plans, elevations, doors, windows, stages, and practical solutions. Serlio becomes the architect of dissemination. His own built work was less extensive than the influence of his books, but projects such as the Château d'Ancy-le-Franc in France demonstrate how his classically informed design language could operate beyond Italy. His career is especially important for your chapter because it clarifies that the Renaissance architect's power lies not only in building finished masterpieces, it also lies in codifying form so that others can build within a common language. In Serlio, the architect becomes a transmitter. He is less the solitary genius on a single dome or church, and more the organizer of a discipline that can travel. Andrea Palladio stands at the far end of this evolution because he combines life story, built achievement, typological invention, and textual system in an unusually complete way. Britannica notes that he was born in Padua in 1508 and became the greatest architect of 16th century northern Italy, while the Met emphasizes how he mastered the formula of the ideal villa as a type governed by repeated architectural rules and a humanist understanding of otium. Palladio did not begin as a celebrated intellectual. He trained as a stonemason and was later taken up by the humanist patron Gian Giorgio Trissino, who recognized his ability, brought him into a learned circle, and even gave him the classical name Palladio. That act of renaming is itself symbolic. It marks the transformation of a craftsman into a figure of antique cultural prestige. Palladio studied Roman ruins on repeated trips to Rome and absorbed them not as isolated motifs but as systems of proportion and type. In Vicenza, he reshaped urban architecture through palaces and public commissions. Above all, the Basilica, where his loggia system created the motif, later called the Palladian window. In his villas, he transformed the country house into an idealized machine of order. Villa Rotonda is the most famous because its centralized hall and 4 identical temple fronts condense symmetry, scenic command, and domestic ritual into a single form, but the broader Palladian villa world is even more significant because it shows repetition with variation. Villa Barbaro, Villa Foscari, Villa Emo, and others reveal a designer who could calibrate center and wing residence and farm buildings, ceremonial front and working landscape. Palladio's completed and incomplete urban church facades in Venice also matter. Britannica notes his designs for San Francesco della Vigna and his major church work in the Veneto. Some of his Venetian palace schemes remained unbuilt, and this fact is instructive. Palladio's influence cannot be measured only by what was completed. It also lies in designs known through the Quattro Libri and drawings that shaped later architecture, far beyond his own region. His 4 books of architecture, published in 1570, summarized ancient architecture, the orders, materials, and many of his own designs, creating one of the most influential architectural books in history. In Palladio, the architect becomes at once builder, surveyor of antiquity, typologist, and print author. His life shows the discipline reaching a mature form in which architecture can be practiced locally and transmitted globally. What binds these architects together is not a single style or even a single philosophy, but a shared relocation of architectural authority. Brunelleschi invents methods and spatial clarity through practical genius shaped by antiquity. Alberti makes architecture self-conscious as a field of theory and lineaments. Bramante turns geometric totality into monumental institutional form. Giuliano da Sangallo fuses court service, antiquarian study, and central planning into both church and villa. Antonio da Sangallo, the younger, turns representation, modeling, and large-scale management into a new kind of architectural control. Raphael demonstrates that the most advanced visual intelligence of the age saw architecture as the highest extension of image-making into lived space. Serlio turns architecture into a printable and exportable language. Palladio transforms that language into a repeatable system of domestic, civic, and sacred order that could survive the death of its author and colonize later centuries. None of them simply built structures. Each reorganized the conditions under which structure could be conceived. This is why the chapter belongs in your video where it does. It is not a detour into biography. It is the moment when the abstract argument acquires human force. These are the minds through which architecture became an instrument for constructing perception itself. The observer who walks through a Renaissance church, palace or villa, is moving through the residue of their decisions, their rivalries, their patrons, their books, their failed projects, their unfinished works, their models, and their acts of reconstruction. The architect is therefore not merely the name attached to the building. He is the designer of the relations that make the building intelligible. He reconstructs space by deciding how it will be ordered before it is occupied, how it will be seen before it is entered, and how it will continue to exert coherence long after the circumstances of its making have disappeared. The emergence of order in Renaissance architecture does not depend solely on the recovery of classical forms or the application of proportion as a regulating principle. It depends on a deeper transformation in how space is conceived, structured, and communicated. Geometry, within this transformation, ceases to function as a tool limited to measurement or construction and becomes a language, a system through which spatial relationships are articulated, organized, and made perceptible. The shift is not merely technical, it is conceptual. Geometry provides a framework that allows architecture to operate as a coherent system, one in which each element derives its meaning from its position within a network of relationships governed by rules that are both abstract and experiential. To understand geometry as a language is to recognize that it does not describe space after the fact. It produces the conditions under which space can be understood. Lines, circles, squares, and ratios are not neutral entities. They are operators that structure perception, that determine how forms relate to one another, how they align, how they repeat, how they vary. The geometric framework precedes the material realization of the building, establishing a system that can be translated into stone, brick, or wood, while maintaining its internal coherence. The building becomes the manifestation of this system, a translation of abstract relationships into a physical environment that can be inhabited and perceived. This transformation is grounded in the intellectual context of the Renaissance, where mathematics is elevated as a means of understanding the world, not only in quantitative terms, but in qualitative ones. Geometry, in particular, is understood as a universal language, capable of expressing relationships that transcend specific materials or contexts. The revival of interest in Euclidean geometry, the study of proportion, and the integration of mathematical thinking into artistic and architectural practice reflect a broader belief that the world can be organized according to rational principles, that these principles can be represented through geometric forms, and that these forms can be perceived as coherent and harmonious. Within architecture, this belief translates into the use of geometric figures as organizing devices. The square, the circle, and their derived proportions become the basis for planning, for structuring elevations, for determining the relationships between different parts of a building. These figures are not chosen arbitrarily. They are selected because they provide a clear and consistent framework within which relationships can be established and maintained. The square, with its equal sides and right angles, offers stability and clarity, while the circle, with its continuous curvature, introduces unity and centralization. The interaction between these forms generates a system that can accommodate both order and variation, both repetition and transformation. The application of geometry as a language is evident in the design process itself, where architects begin with diagrams that establish the underlying structure of the building. These diagrams are not mere representations. They are generative tools that define the relationships between elements before those elements are constructed. The plan, in particular, becomes a site of geometric organization, where the placement of walls, columns, and openings is determined according to a system of lines and proportions that ensure coherence. The elevation and section extend this organization into the vertical dimension, maintaining consistency across different views and ensuring that the building operates as a unified system. This coherence is not limited to the overall composition. It extends to the smallest details, where the proportions of individual elements are aligned with the larger system. The height of a column corresponds to the spacing between columns. The dimensions of a window relate to the proportions of the facade, and the articulation of decorative elements follows the same geometric logic that governs the structure. The result is a building in which every part participates in the same language, reinforcing the sense that the space is organized according to a coherent and intelligible system. The perceptual consequences of this geometric organization are significant. When the relationships between elements are consistent and aligned, the observer experiences the space as stable and comprehensible. The eye follows lines that lead to focal points, recognizes patterns that repeat across the composition, and perceives proportions that create a sense of balance. This experience does not require conscious analysis. It occurs at the level of perception as a direct response to the organization of the space. Geometry, therefore, functions not only as a design tool, but as a perceptual guide, shaping how the environment is seen and understood. The role of geometry in shaping perception can be further understood through the relationship between architecture and perspective. As explored by Erwin Panofsky, perspective establishes a system in which space is organized relative to a fixed point of view, creating a coherent visual field that aligns with the observer's position. In architecture, this alignment is achieved through the use of axes, symmetry, and proportional relationships that direct attention and stabilize orientation. The geometry of the space is not only a structural framework, it is a visual framework that determines how the space is perceived from specific viewpoints. This alignment between geometry and perception is particularly evident in spaces that emphasize axial organization, where the arrangement of elements guides the observer's gaze along a defined path. The axis functions as a line of coherence, connecting different parts of the building and creating a sense of continuity that extends beyond individual spaces. As the observer moves along this axis, the relationships between elements remain consistent, reinforcing the perception of order and stability. The geometry of the space becomes a narrative, a sequence of relationships that unfold in a controlled and predictable manner. At the same time, geometry allows for variation within this system, providing a framework within which different forms can be integrated without disrupting the overall coherence. The use of modular proportions enables architects to scale elements up or down, to adjust relationships according to specific conditions, while maintaining consistency with the underlying system. This flexibility ensures that geometry functions not as a rigid constraint, but as a guiding structure, one that can accommodate different requirements, while preserving the integrity of the composition. The language of geometry also extends to the relationship between architecture and the human body. The use of proportion as a means of organizing space reflects a belief that the dimensions of the built environment should correspond to the dimensions of the human figure, creating a sense of alignment between the individual and the space. This alignment is not literal, but relational. It establishes a framework within which the observer can perceive the space as scaled to human experience. The proportions of a room, the height of a ceiling, the spacing of elements, all contribute to a sense that the space is calibrated to the body, that it can be navigated and understood without discomfort or disorientation. However, this calibration is not neutral. It establishes a specific relationship between the observer and the environment, one in which perception is guided by the geometric structure of the space. The observer is not free to interpret the space in any way. The geometry directs attention, organizes movement, and defines the conditions under which the space is experienced. This direction is subtle, operating through alignment and proportion rather than explicit instruction, but its effects are pervasive. The space appears natural because its structure aligns with perceptual expectations, but this alignment is the result of deliberate design. The use of geometry as a language also introduces a degree of abstraction into architecture, separating the conceptual framework of the building from its material realization. The geometric diagram exists independently of the materials used to construct the building, allowing the same system to be applied across different contexts. This abstraction enables the transmission of architectural ideas through drawings and treatises, where the relationships between elements can be represented and studied without reference to specific materials. The diagram becomes a tool for communication, a way of conveying the structure of the space in a form that can be understood and replicated. This separation between concept and material does not diminish the importance of construction. It redefines it. The act of building becomes the process of translating a geometric system into a physical form, ensuring that the relationships established in the diagram are maintained in the material realization. The success of this translation depends on the precision with which the geometric relationships are preserved, as any deviation can disrupt the coherence of the system. The building, therefore, becomes a test of the diagram, a demonstration of the ability to convert abstract relationships into tangible space. The integration of geometry into architecture also reflects a broader shift in how knowledge is organized and applied during the Renaissance. As explored by Michel Foucault, the period is characterized by the emergence of systems that classify, measure, and organize the world according to rational principles. Geometry participates in this transformation by providing a framework that can be used to structure space in a way that is both systematic and perceptible. The building becomes part of this system, an environment that embodies the principles of order and classification that define the intellectual context of the time. At the same time, the use of geometry does not eliminate the experiential dimension of architecture. It shapes it. The observer does not encounter geometry as an abstract system, but as a condition that influences how the space is perceived and navigated. The alignment of elements, the repetition of forms, the consistency of proportions, all contribute to a sense of coherence that is experienced directly. Geometry operates beneath the surface of perception, guiding the observer without requiring explicit awareness of the system that produces this guidance. This invisibility is essential to the effectiveness of geometry as a language. If the geometric structure were immediately apparent as a constructed system, the experience of naturalness would be disrupted. The success of Renaissance architecture lies in its ability to integrate geometry into the fabric of the building in such a way that its presence is felt, but not explicitly recognized. The observer experiences the effects of the system without perceiving the system itself, allowing the space to appear as though it is inherently ordered, rather than deliberately constructed. As the exploration of Renaissance architecture continues, the role of geometry becomes increasingly central, not only as a tool for organizing space, but as a means of shaping perception at a fundamental level. The language of geometry provides a framework within which the principles of order, proportion, and alignment can be articulated and applied, creating environments that are both intelligible and experiential. The building becomes a translation of this language, a space in which abstract relationships are made tangible, in which the logic of geometry is expressed through the arrangement of forms and the organization of space. And as this language is encountered, not as a set of rules, but as a lived experience, it transforms the way space is perceived. The lines that guide the eye, the proportions that create balance, the alignments that produce coherence, all reveal that architecture is not simply a matter of constructing walls and roofs, but of constructing relationships, of creating a system that shapes how the world is seen and understood. Geometry in this sense, is not only a language of design, it is a language of perception, one that continues to operate long after the building has been completed, shaping the experience of those who move through it, often without their awareness, but never without its influence. The introduction of linear perspective during the Renaissance establishes a regime in which space is constructed, relative to a determinate point of view, converting vision into a system governed by projection, alignment, and convergence. Perspective is not a neutral technique, it is an epistemic structure that organizes how space can be known. The visual field is coordinated through orthogonals that converge toward a vanishing point, a horizon that stabilizes scale, and a proportional diminution that renders distance measurable. The resulting image appears continuous and coherent because its elements are subordinated to a single organizing principle. This coherence depends on the position of the observer. Without the alignment of the eye to the constructed viewpoint, the system loses its precision. Perspective, therefore, defines not only space, but the conditions under which space can be perceived. The theoretical implications of this system are articulated by Erwin Panofsky, who identifies perspective as a symbolic form that reconfigures the relation between subject and object. Space becomes homogeneous, continuous and infinite, organized as a mathematical field rather than as a collection of discrete places. The observer is positioned as the origin of this field, the point from which all relations are measured. This positioning produces a stable visual order, but it also introduces a dependency. The coherence of the field is contingent upon the observer occupying the correct position. The system produces objectivity through a constructed subjectivity. The operationalization of perspective in architecture requires translation from pictorial projection to spatial organization. This translation occurs through axes, symmetry, and hierarchical alignment that correspond to the logic of projection. The axis functions as an organizing line that structures both plan and elevation, directing attention and establishing a sequence of aligned elements. Symmetry reinforces this alignment by producing bilateral equivalence, ensuring that relationships remain consistent across the visual field. Hierarchy organizes scale and emphasis, directing the observer toward focal points that correspond to the vanishing structure of perspective. The interior of St. Peter's Basilica demonstrates the integration of these principles at a monumental scale. The nave is organized along a dominant longitudinal axis, with a repetitive colonnade that establishes a rhythm of orthogonals, receding toward the apse. The convergence of these elements produces a perspectival field in which the altar functions as a focal point aligned with the vanishing structure. The dome, positioned at the crossing, introduces a centralized emphasis that stabilizes the vertical dimension. The observer is situated within a coordinated system in which horizontal and vertical axes intersect, producing a unified spatial order. The perception of coherence depends on alignment with this system. The relation between architecture and perspective can be further analyzed through the concept of projection geometry. In linear perspective, the transformation of three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional plane is governed by projective relations that preserve alignment while altering scale. Architecture inverts this process by constructing three-dimensional space, according to principles derived from projection. The building becomes a three-dimensional projection of an abstract system. The plan corresponds to a geometric schema. The elevation corresponds to a projected order. The section maintains consistency across dimensions. The observer encounters a space that has been constructed to align with the logic of projection, producing a perceptual field that appears coherent from specific viewpoints. The fixation of the observer within this field introduces a structural asymmetry between space and perception. Space is constructed to be coherent from a privileged position. Perception is guided toward that position. The observer's movement is not prohibited, but the system privileges certain viewpoints by offering greater clarity and alignment. This privilege is achieved through spatial cues, axial corridors, framed vistas, thresholds that reveal focal points, and gradients of scale that direct attention. The observer is guided toward positions where the system resolves most clearly. This guidance operates through mechanisms that can be analyzed using the framework of Michel Foucault, who examines how spatial organization structures visibility and behavior. Although Foucault's primary examples are drawn from later institutional architectures, the underlying principle is applicable. Space can be arranged to produce a field of visibility that positions subjects within a network of relations. In perspectival architecture, visibility is organized through alignment and projection. The observer is not only seeing, the observer is positioned within a system that determines how seeing occurs. The architecture produces a regime of visibility in which certain relations are emphasized and others are suppressed. The construction of this regime depends on the suppression of variability. Perspective requires consistency in the scaling of elements, uniformity in the convergence of lines, and stability in the horizon. Architectural translation requires corresponding consistency. Columns must align, bays must repeat, proportions must maintain ratios across sequences. Deviations introduce distortion, disrupting the coherence of the perspectival field. The system therefore enforces regularity. Regularity produces predictability. Predictability produces legibility. The perceptual effect of this regularity can be analyzed through the psychology of vision. The human visual system tends to organize stimuli according to principles of continuity, closure, and alignment. Perspective exploits these tendencies by providing strong directional cues that guide the eye along converging lines. The observer perceives depth through the systematic diminution of scale and the convergence of orthogonals. Architectural alignment reinforces these cues, producing a stable perception of space. The observer does not calculate depth. The system produces it. The dependence of coherence on viewpoint introduces a critical limitation. As the observer deviates from the privileged position, the alignment of elements shifts. Orthogonals no longer converge as expected, and proportional relationships appear distorted. The system remains intact, but its perceptual effect changes. This phenomenon reveals that perspectival coherence is not an intrinsic property of space, but a conditional effect. The fixed viewer is a requirement of the system, not a natural position. This conditionality is exploited in architectural practice through the creation of multiple perspectival setups within a single building. Corridors, courtyards, and enfilades are arranged to produce successive moments of alignment, each with its own focal point. The observer moves from one privileged position to another, experiencing a sequence of resolved perspectives. The building becomes a series of perspectival fields connected through movement. The experience of coherence is distributed across these fields, rather than confined to a single viewpoint. The use of enfilade in palatial architecture exemplifies this strategy. A sequence of rooms aligned along a single axis produces a continuous visual corridor in which doorways frame successive spaces. Each threshold functions as a frame that reinforces the alignment of the axis, producing a perspectival depth that extends beyond individual rooms. The observer experiences a telescoping effect, where space appears to recede indefinitely. Movement through the sequence maintains the alignment, producing a dynamic extension of the perspectival field. The manipulation of scale further reinforces the system. Elements closer to the observer are larger. Those further away are smaller, consistent with the logic of diminution. Architectural design can exaggerate or moderate this effect by adjusting proportions, creating illusions of greater depth or compression. This manipulation aligns with the techniques of quadratura and perspectival illusionism in painting, where architectural elements are extended or transformed to produce a continuous visual field. The boundary between real and represented space becomes permeable. The theoretical relationship between perspective and measurement is central to its authority. Perspective renders space quantifiable by establishing proportional relationships that correspond to distance. The observer can infer scale and depth because the system maintains consistent ratios. This quantification aligns with the broader Renaissance emphasis on measurement as a means of knowledge. Space becomes an object that can be analyzed, represented, and controlled. The connection between perspective and control extends to urban planning. Streets are aligned to create long vistas. Squares are organized around focal monuments. Facades are regulated to maintain consistent heights and rhythms. The city becomes a network of perspectival fields, each structured to produce coherent views. The observer navigates a sequence of aligned spaces, experiencing order at multiple scales. The urban environment functions as an extension of the architectural system. The role of the observer within this environment can be further examined through the concept of subjectivity. Perspective positions the observer as the center of the visual field, but this centrality is constructed. The observer occupies a position that has been defined by the system. The apparent autonomy of perception is therefore mediated by the architecture. The observer is both the origin of the visual field and a product of its organization. This duality can be analyzed through the philosophical framework of the subject-object relations. In perspectival space, the object is organized relative to the subject, but the subject is also constrained by the object structure. The relationship is reciprocal. The observer perceives the space, but the space determines the conditions of perception. The fixed viewer is a conceptual construct that stabilizes this relationship. The limitations of the fixed viewer become more apparent when contrasted with alternative spatial systems that accommodate multiple viewpoints. In such systems, coherence is not dependent on a single position, but emerges through movement. The Renaissance development of perspective represents a specific solution to the problem of spatial organization, one that prioritizes stability and clarity through fixation. Other solutions distribute coherence across sequences and variations. The persistence of perspective within architectural practice demonstrates its effectiveness in producing legible environments. The system provides a clear framework for organizing space, guiding perception, and structuring movement. Its limitations are offset by its capacity to generate strong visual coherence. The fixed viewer is a constraint, but it is also a mechanism that enables the construction of ordered space. The integration of perspective with other architectural principles such as geometry, proportion, and symmetry produces a comprehensive system in which each element reinforces the others. Geometry provides the underlying structure. Proportion ensures relational consistency. Symmetry stabilizes alignment. Perspective organizes perception. The building operates as a coordinated system in which these components interact to produce a coherent experience. The invisibility of this coordination is essential. The observer experiences the effects of the system without perceiving its mechanisms. The alignment of elements appears natural. The convergence of lines appears inherent. The coherence of the space appears self-evident. The system withdraws behind its effects, allowing the architecture to present itself as a stable and intelligible environment. As movement continues through the museum, the presence of this system becomes perceptible through its effects. Certain positions produce clarity, others introduce distortion. Axes guide attention, thresholds frame views, sequences align perspectives. The observer becomes aware of being positioned within a field that has been constructed to organize perception. The neutrality of space is replaced by the recognition of structure. The concept of the fixed viewer therefore reveals a fundamental aspect of Renaissance architecture, the construction of perception through the alignment of geometry and vision. Perspective is not an addition to architecture. It is a principle that informs its organization. The building becomes a device that produces a specific visual experience, one that depends on the position of the observer and the structure of the space. This understanding prepares the transition to the next stage of analysis, where symmetry and balance are examined as mechanisms that reinforce the stability of the perspectival field. If perspective establishes the alignment of vision, symmetry stabilizes that alignment by distributing relations evenly across the composition. The integration of these systems produces the characteristic coherence of Renaissance architecture, a coherence that is constructed through the precise coordination of multiple mechanisms, each shaping perception in a specific way. Symmetry in Renaissance architecture operates as a regulatory system that organizes relations across an axis, distributes equivalences, and stabilizes perception through predictable correspondences. It is not reducible to mirroring. It is a structuring principle that coordinates geometry, proportion, and sequence into a coherent field. The experience of balance emerges from this coordination. Balance is therefore not an intrinsic property of forms, but an effect produced by the alignment of elements within a system that minimizes deviation and maximizes correspondence. The theoretical foundation for symmetry is embedded in the proportional doctrines articulated by Leon Battista Alberti, where consinitas requires the fitting together of parts through measurable relations. Symmetry functions as a constraint that ensures these relations remain consistent across a composition. The axis provides a reference line. Elements are positioned at equal distances and scaled according to corresponding ratios. The result is a distribution of equivalences that can be apprehended without sequential analysis. The observer perceives a whole because the parts are organized to confirm one another. This organization aligns with classical precedents codified through the reception of Vitruvius, where symmetry denotes commensurability among parts. Renaissance interpretation transforms this commensurability into a perceptual system. Ratios are not only structural, they are visual. The facade and interior articulate proportional sequences that remain legible across scales. The orders, standardized by Sebastiano Celio and Giacomo Barozzi da Vignola, provide modules that can be mirrored and repeated. Standardization reduces variance. Reduced variance increases predictability. Predictability produces immediate legibility. The perceptual efficacy of symmetry can be analyzed through Gestalt principles, particularly those of similarity, proximity, and symmetry itself. The visual system groups elements that are alike and aligned. Mirrored arrangements are processed rapidly as unified wholes. Symmetry minimizes the need for serial inspection by providing redundant information across the axis. The observer infers the whole from a part because the system guarantees equivalence. This redundancy produces cognitive economy. The space appears clear because its structure reduces processing demands. In architectural composition, the axis operates as both geometric organizer and perceptual guide. It aligns entrances, bays, and focal points into a continuous line that structures movement and vision. The axis does not merely divide, it orders sequences. As the observer advances along it, successive elements confirm the initial alignment, reinforcing the perception of coherence. The axis thus functions as a vector that stabilizes orientation and directs attention. The Facade of Santa Maria Novella by Leon Battista Alberti exemplifies this system. The composition integrates a lower basilican structure with an upper classical order through a proportional schema that maintains symmetry across the central axis. Volutes mediate between levels, preserving continuity while accommodating difference. The geometry is explicit. Squares and rectangles regulate the facade. Circles and arcs introduce controlled variation. The observer perceives a unified composition because each element participates in a network of correspondences, anchored by the axis. At the scale of interior space, symmetry coordinates volumes and sequences. In St. Peter's Basilica, the longitudinal axis organizes the nave, transept, and apse into a hierarchical sequence. Side chapels are paired and mirrored. Columnar rhythms repeat at regular intervals. The crossing establishes a centralized equilibrium under the dome. The system integrates bilateral symmetry with axial progression, producing a composite order that remains legible across movement. The observer's position along the axis yields maximum coherence. Lateral displacement introduces variation without collapsing the system. The integration of symmetry with perspective intensifies this effect. As analyzed by Erwin Panofsky, perspectival organization stabilizes the visual field through convergence toward a vanishing point. Symmetry reinforces this convergence by ensuring that elements on either side of the axis align with the projection. The combined system produces a field in which geometry and vision coincide. The observer experiences balance because the distribution of elements corresponds to the logic of projection. The harmonic dimension of proportional systems, as demonstrated by Rudolf Wittker, further explains the perceptual coherence of symmetrical compositions. Ratios analogous to musical consonances regulate dimensions and intervals. Symmetry distributes these ratios evenly, ensuring that corresponding parts maintain identical relations. The building thus operates as a harmonic structure in which equivalences reinforce one another. The observer perceives unity as an effect of consistent proportional relations. Symmetry also functions as a mechanism of control. Through the framework outlined by Michel Foucault, spatial organization can be understood as a means of structuring visibility and behavior. Symmetrical arrangements produce fields in which deviations are immediately apparent and therefore discouraged. The predictability of the system guides movement along preferred paths and aligns attention with designated focal points. Control is exercised through coherence rather than constraint. The observer is not compelled, the observer is oriented. The distribution of symmetry across scales is critical to its effectiveness. At the level of the plan, symmetry organizes primary volumes. At the level of elevation, it regulates facade articulation. At the level of detail, it governs the repetition of motifs. Consistency across scales ensures that local variations do not disrupt global coherence. The observer encounters a nested system in which each level confirms the others. This nesting produces a stable perceptual environment. The capacity of symmetry to accommodate variation without loss of coherence depends on hierarchical organization. Primary axes and major divisions establish the framework. Secondary elements introduce controlled differences. Variations are permitted within limits defined by the system. For example, paired chapels may contain distinct artworks while maintaining identical spatial envelopes. Facade bays may vary in decoration while preserving proportional alignment. The system absorbs variation by constraining its distribution. The perceptual illusion of balance arises from this hierarchical control. The observer experiences equilibrium because deviations are contained and counterbalanced. The system produces equivalence at the level of structure, even when surface differences are present. Balance is therefore not a direct reflection of identical parts. It is the outcome of regulated relations. The limitations of symmetry become evident when the axis is compromised or when proportional relations are inconsistent. Misalignments disrupt the redundancy that supports rapid grouping. Irregular intervals introduce ambiguity. Unequal scaling produces imbalance. The observer must then engage in serial inspection, reconstructing relations through effort. The experience shifts from immediate comprehension to analytical processing. This shift reveals the dependence of perceived balance on the integrity of the system. Northern adaptations of classical vocabulary demonstrate how symmetry can be mediated rather than eliminated. Facades such as Antwerp City Hall maintain bilateral organization while incorporating dense surface articulation that complicates immediate reading. The axis remains operative, but ornament introduces local variations that require attention. The system distributes information across multiple registers. Coherence is preserved, but its perception is delayed. This condition illustrates that symmetry can coexist with complexity when hierarchical control is maintained. Urban applications extend symmetrical principles to larger scales. Squares and avenues are organized around central axes. Facades align to produce continuous planes. Monuments occupy focal positions that anchor the field. The observer navigates a sequence of symmetrical compositions, each reinforcing orientation. The city becomes a network of axes and centers. The perception of order persists across transitions because the same principles operate at different scales. The temporal dimension of symmetry is often overlooked. Although symmetry is associated with static balance, its effects unfold through movement. As the observer approaches a symmetrical facade, the axis becomes increasingly dominant. As the observer enters and proceeds along it, successive correspondences confirm the system. The experience is dynamic, even if the composition is static. The illusion of balance is maintained through continuous reinforcement across time. The relation between symmetry and memory further clarifies its role. Symmetrical compositions are easier to recall because their structure can be encoded as a simple schema. The axis and paired elements provide a template that reduces complexity. The observer retains the whole because it can be reconstructed from a part. This mnemonic efficiency contributes to the perception of clarity and order. The integration of symmetry with other mechanisms, geometry, proportion, perspective, produces a composite system in which each component supports the others. Geometry defines relations, proportion quantifies them, symmetry distributes them, perspective aligns them with vision. The building operates as a coordinated apparatus that generates a stable perceptual field. The observer experiences balance because multiple systems converge to produce it. The invisibility of these mechanisms is essential. The observer does not perceive axes as abstractions or ratios as numbers. The observer perceives alignment and agreement. The system withdraws behind its effects. Balance appears inherent because its construction is concealed. This concealment is not incidental. It is a condition of effectiveness. If the mechanisms were explicit, the experience would shift from immediate perception to analytical awareness. The concept of symmetry as illusion does not imply falsity, it indicates construction. Balance is real as an experience, but it is produced through design. The term illusion identifies the gap between appearance and mechanism. The observer experiences equilibrium without perceiving the operations that generate it. Architecture exploits this gap to produce environments that appear natural while being highly structured. The comparative absence of symmetry produces contrasting effects. Asymmetrical arrangements distribute information unevenly, requiring movement and attention to construct coherence. The observer encounters sequences rather than wholes. This condition aligns with alternative perceptual regimes in which understanding is temporal. The Renaissance emphasis on symmetry represents a preference for immediate intelligibility, for environments that can be apprehended without extended engagement. The persistence of symmetry across Renaissance architecture indicates its effectiveness as a tool for constructing order. It provides a clear method for organizing relations, stabilizing perception, and guiding movement. Its limitations are managed through hierarchical variation and integration with other systems. The result is an architecture that produces a consistent experience of balance across diverse contexts. As movement continues through the museum, the operation of symmetry becomes evident through its effects. Axes align views. Paired elements confirm orientation. Proportional sequences reinforce coherence. The observer recognizes balance as a condition that persists across spaces. This recognition shifts attention from surfaces to structures, from appearance to organization. The analysis of symmetry prepares the examination of scale as a complementary mechanism. If symmetry stabilizes relations across an axis, scale modulates the intensity of those relations by adjusting the size of elements relative to the body. Together, they determine how balance is experienced not only visually, but physically. Scale in Renaissance architecture operates as a structured relation that organizes magnitude through proportion, geometry, perception, and sequence, producing effects that are simultaneously cognitive, affective, and political. It is necessary to distinguish with precision between size as a measurable quantity and scale as a relational construct. Size belongs to measurement, while scale belongs to perception. Scale emerges when dimensions are interpreted in relation to the body, to adjacent elements, and to an overall system that governs their arrangement. This relational condition determines how space is experienced and understood. The experience of power arises from this condition, not from magnitude alone, but from the structured disparity between the observer and the architectural field, a disparity that is stabilized through proportional coherence. Renaissance architecture develops scale as an apparatus that allows a magnitude to exceed the body without dissolving intelligibility, producing environments that remain ordered while asserting dominance over perception. The theoretical basis for this apparatus can be traced to Vitruvius, whose formulation of proportion establishes the human body as the origin of architectural measurement. Vitruvius defines proportion as a correspondence between parts that reflects the harmonious organization of the body itself. Renaissance architects inherit this principle but transform its function. The body becomes a reference point rather than a boundary. Proportional systems derived from bodily ratios are extended across larger magnitudes, allowing architecture to maintain coherence while surpassing human scale. This extension produces a dual condition in which the observer recognizes familiar relationships, but experiences them at an unfamiliar magnitude. The body is both included within and exceeded by the system. This condition is essential to the experience of power, because it positions the observer within a structure that remains intelligible, yet inaccessible to direct correspondence. The harmonic interpretation of proportion articulated by Rudolf Virchow provides a precise account of how coherence is preserved across scale. Virchow demonstrates that Renaissance architects employed ratios analogous to musical consonances to structure spatial relationships. These ratios maintain perceptual stability regardless of magnitude. A room structured according to a 1:2 ratio remains coherent, whether it measures 10 units or 100 units. This invariance allows scale to function as an amplification of order, rather than a deviation from it. The observer perceives unity because the proportional relationships remain consistent, even as the dimensions exceed immediate comprehension. The building thus operates as a harmonic system in which magnitude intensifies rather than disrupts coherence. The integration of scale with perspectival organization further extends this system by aligning physical magnitude with visual structure. The analysis of Erwin Panofsky establishes that linear perspective constructs space as a continuous and homogeneous field in which size is regulated according to distance. Architecture translates this optical principle into material form through the repetition of elements, the alignment of axes, and the modulation of intervals. In St. Peter's Basilica, the longitudinal extension of the nave, the rhythmic spacing of columns, and the curvature of the dome produce a spatial field in which magnitude is experienced as both depth and volume. The observer perceives an environment that extends beyond immediate limits, yet remains structured by consistent relationships. The building coordinates visual and physical scale into a unified system, ensuring that magnitude is perceived as ordered rather than chaotic. The effective dimension of this experience is illuminated through the philosophical frameworks developed by Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant. in which the concept of the sublime describes the response to magnitude that exceeds the capacity of the immediate comprehension. In architectural terms, this response is produced through the combination of proportional clarity and spatial vastness. The observer recognizes the structure of the space, but cannot fully grasp its extent within a single perceptual act. The dome, as a continuous geometric form, exemplifies this condition by enclosing a volume that appears unified, yet immeasurable. The upward direction of the gaze, the curvature of the surface, and the absence of clear boundaries contribute to a perception of infinite extension. The experience of power emerges from this tension between comprehension and excess, from the recognition that the space operates according to a system that surpasses the scale of the body. Scale operates through hierarchical organization, distributing magnitude across different levels of the architectural system to produce a layered experience. Primary spaces are dimensioned to exceed the body, secondary spaces mediate between these volumes and human scale, and tertiary elements provide points of reference that anchor perception. This hierarchy allows the observer to navigate large environments without losing orientation. In Palazzo Rucellai, the facade demonstrates this principle through the superimposition of orders that correspond to different scales. The lower level relates more directly to the human body, while the upper levels extend beyond it, creating a vertical hierarchy that organizes perception. The observer reads the building through this layered structure, moving between local detail and global magnitude. The sequencing of scale intensifies its perceptual effects by structuring movement as a progression of transformations. Renaissance architecture frequently employs compression and expansion to recalibrate the observer's perception. Narrow entrances and lower ceilings precede larger volumes, creating a contrast that amplifies the experience of magnitude. In the approach to centralized spaces, such as the Tempietto, the transition from the surrounding environment to the central structure produces a shift in scale that heightens the perception of unity and enclosure. The observer moves from a dispersed field into a concentrated volume, experiencing a reorientation of both perception and movement. The regulation of movement through scalar transitions can be analyzed within the framework of Michel Foucault, who identifies spatial organization as a means of structuring relationships of power. Monumental scale positions the observer within a field that exceeds individual agency, creating a condition in which the architecture asserts authority through its magnitude. This assertion is not symbolic alone, but experiential, as the observer's diminished relative size corresponds to the perceived dominance of the structure. The building defines the observer's position, guiding movement and attention through the organization of space. The experience of power is therefore embedded in the spatial system itself, rather than imposed externally. The phenomenological account of perception developed by Maurice Merleau-Ponty further clarifies how scale is experienced through the body. Perception is not a detached process, but an embodied one, grounded in movement, orientation, and sensory engagement. Large-scale environments alter bodily behavior, slowing movement, extending gaze, and reorienting posture. These changes are not voluntary, but produced by the structure of the space. In expansive interiors, the observer's pace decreases, attention shifts upward, and the body adjusts to the magnitude of the environment. Light and acoustics reinforce this experience, as large volumes disperse sound and create gradients of illumination that emphasize depth and height. The observer experiences scale as a multisensory condition that integrates visual, auditory, and kinesthetic perception. The articulation of architectural elements across multiple scales contributes to the legibility of this system by providing points of reference that allow the observer to navigate between local and global dimensions. Large columns unify expansive surfaces, while smaller details anchor perception at the level of the body. In the Basilica of San Lorenzo, the spacing of columns and the height of arches establish a rhythmic structure that maintains proportional coherence while extending beyond immediate bodily scale. The observer recognizes patterns and infers the underlying system, allowing the space to be perceived as both ordered and expansive. Modular systems reinforce this structure by repeating proportional units across magnitudes, producing rhythms that extend throughout the building. These modules function as a visual and spatial language, enabling the observer to recognize relationships between elements without explicit measurement. The repetition of modules creates continuity, while their scaling produces variation. This combination allows architecture to maintain coherence while accommodating different magnitudes, ensuring that the observer can navigate the space without losing orientation. Centralized plans concentrate scale around a focal point, producing a condition in which the observer is positioned within a symmetrical field that extends equally in all directions. The dome encloses a volume that appears continuous and unified, creating a perception of completeness that surrounds the observer. In contrast, longitudinal plans distribute scale along an axis, emphasizing depth and progression. The observer experiences magnitude as a sequence, moving through a series of spaces that reveal their dimensions gradually. This distinction between centralized and longitudinal organization demonstrates that scale can be constructed in different ways, producing different perceptual effects. Urban environments extend these principles to a larger scale, organizing streets, squares, and buildings into a network of relationships that structure perception across the city. In spaces such as the Piazza della Signoria, the dimensions of the square, the alignment of facades, and the placement of monuments create a coherent field in which scale is experienced collectively. The observer navigates this field through movement, encountering different magnitudes that correspond to different functions and levels of importance. The city becomes an extension of the architectural system, applying the same principles of proportion and scale to a broader environment. The Northern Renaissance introduces variations in the use of scale, often integrating large volumes with complex and fragmented compositions. In Château de Chambord, magnitude is distributed across multiple elements, rather than concentrated in a single volume. Towers, staircases, and roof structures create a layered profile that requires the movement and attention to be understood. The observer experiences scale through accumulation and variation, rather than through immediate comprehension. This approach demonstrates that scale can produce complexity as well as coherence, depending on how it is integrated with other architectural elements. Material conditions influence scalar perception by affecting how surfaces are read and how light interacts with form. Smooth surfaces emphasize continuity and magnitude, while textured materials introduce variation that can fragment or enrich the perception of scale. Light, entering through different openings, creates patterns of illumination that highlight or obscure certain elements, altering the perception of size and depth over time. These conditions demonstrate that scale is not fixed, but dynamic, shaped by environmental factors as well as by design. The distinction between absolute and relative scale is essential for understanding how architectural effects are produced. Absolute scale refers to measurable dimensions, while relative scale refers to perceived size in relation to the body and surrounding elements. Architecture operates primarily through relative scale, manipulating context and sequence to produce specific effects. A space may appear larger or smaller, depending on its relation to adjacent spaces, demonstrating that scale is a perceptual construct rather than a fixed property. The temporal dimension of scale further complicates this construct, as perception unfolds over time rather than being completed in a single moment. Initial exposure to large-scale environments produces an immediate effective response, while continued movement allows the observer to recognize patterns and integrate the space into a coherent system. This dual process reflects the operation of scale as both an immediate and sustained condition, shaping perception through sequence as well as through magnitude. The integration of scale with symmetry and perspective produces a comprehensive system in which each element reinforces the others. Symmetry distributes relations across an axis. Perspective aligns those relations with vision, and scale amplifies them beyond the dimensions of the body. The observer experiences this integration as a unified field, one that is both structured and expansive. The mechanisms that produce this field remain implicit, allowing the architecture to appear natural even as it operates through precise organization. As movement continues through the museum, the operation of scale becomes perceptible through its effects, through transitions between compression and expansion, through the alignment of elements, through the modulation of light and sound. The observer becomes aware of their position within a system that exceeds individual dimensions, while remaining coherent and intelligible. Scale reveals itself as a language that communicates through magnitude, organizing perception and constructing experience. The experience of power that emerges from this system is not imposed, but produced, arising from the relationship between the body and the architectural field. The building does not simply occupy space. It constructs a field in which the observer is measured, oriented, and positioned. The recognition of this field transforms the perception of space, revealing that scale is not a neutral attribute, but a mechanism through which architecture shapes how the world is seen and understood. Movement in Renaissance architecture is not an incidental consequence of inhabiting space. It is a constructed condition, a system through which perception is organized over time. Space is not encountered all at once, but unfolds through sequences, thresholds, alignments, and transitions that guide the observer's path. Architecture anticipates this movement and structures it, producing a choreography in which the body becomes an instrument through which spatial order is revealed. The experience of space is therefore temporal. It depends on progression, on the relation between one position and the next, on the accumulation of perceptions that together construct coherence. The theoretical basis for understanding movement as a component of spatial organization can be grounded in the phenomenological framework of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who argues that perception is inseparable from bodily movement and orientation. Space is not a fixed object presented to a passive observer. It is constituted through engagement, through the continuous interaction between body and environment. Renaissance architecture, although grounded in geometric and proportional systems, implicitly operates within this embodied logic. It constructs environments that require movement in order to be understood, even when those environments appear immediately coherent. Movement does not disrupt order, it confirms and extends it. The relationship between movement and spatial intelligibility is already present in the theoretical writings of Leon Battista Alberti, where architecture is described as a system of parts that must be experienced in relation to one another. Although Alberti emphasizes proportion and harmony, these qualities are not static. They are revealed through the sequence of spaces, through the progression from exterior to interior, from entrance to focal point. The observer's path becomes the medium through which the architectural system is perceived. This progression is structured through axes that organize both movement and vision. The axis functions as a guiding line, directing the observer through space, while aligning elements within a coherent sequence. In the nave of St. Peter's Basilica, the longitudinal axis draws the observer forward, establishing a continuous relationship between entrance, crossing, and altar. Movement along this axis produces a series of aligned views, each reinforcing the coherence of the space. The observer is not wandering freely. They are guided, their path anticipated by the architecture. The concept of guidance is central to the role of movement in Renaissance architecture. The building does not impose a single path, but it organizes possibilities in such a way that certain movements become more likely than others. Entrances are positioned to align with axes, corridors lead toward focal points, and thresholds frame views that invite progression. The observer's movement is shaped by these conditions, producing a sense of inevitability in the sequence of spaces. The architecture does not restrict movement, it directs it. This direction operates through a combination of spatial cues that structure perception and orientation. Changes in scale, light and proportion signal transitions between spaces, indicating where movement should continue or pause. Narrow passages lead to larger volumes, darker areas lead to illuminated spaces, and lower ceilings lead to higher ones. These contrasts create a rhythm of movement, a pattern of compression and expansion that organizes the observer's experience. The building becomes a sequence of moments, each defined by a specific configuration of spatial conditions. The temporal nature of this sequence aligns with the analysis of space as a constructed field of relations, as explored by Michel Foucault. Although Foucault's work focuses on later architectural forms, his understanding of space as a system that structures behavior can be applied to Renaissance architecture. Movement is not neutral. It is guided by the arrangement of space, by the positioning of elements that influence how the observer navigates the environment. The building becomes a mechanism that produces specific patterns of movement, shaping the observer's experience through its organization. The use of enfilade in Renaissance palaces exemplifies this mechanism, where a sequence of rooms is aligned along a single axis, allowing the observer to move through a continuous spatial field. Each doorway frames the next, creating a visual and physical connection that extends through the entire sequence. The observer experiences space as a progression, where each room is understood in relation to the others. Movement becomes a means of revealing the structure of the building, as the alignment of spaces produces a sense of continuity that extends beyond individual rooms. In contrast to centralized spaces, where the observer can perceive the whole from a single position, longitudinal sequences require movement to construct coherence. The observer cannot grasp the entire system at once. They must traverse it, encountering each part in relation to the others. This distinction highlights the role of movement as a necessary condition for understanding certain types of architectural organization. Space is not only designed to be seen, it is designed to be traversed. The relationship between movement and perception is further reinforced by the interaction between space and light. Light does not remain constant as the observer moves. It shifts, revealing different aspects of the environment at different moments. In spaces, such as Basilica of San Lorenzo, the distribution of light emphasizes certain elements, while leaving others in shadow, creating a dynamic interplay that changes with movement. The observer's path determines what is visible and when, producing a sequence of visual experiences that unfold over time. The modulation of light contributes to the perception of depth and direction, guiding the observer through space. Brighter areas attract attention, drawing movement toward them, while darker areas recede, creating a sense of mystery or transition. This interplay between light and movement reinforces the architectural sequence, aligning visual perception with physical progression. The observer does not simply move through space. They move toward light, toward areas that are visually emphasized by the building's design. The concept of movement as a structuring principle can also be understood through the analysis of rhythm, where repetition and variation create patterns that organize perception over time. Architectural elements such as columns, arches, and bays are arranged in sequences that establish a rhythm, guiding the observer's movement through their repetition. This rhythm is not uniform. It includes variations that signal transitions, changes in function, or shifts in scale. The observer experiences this rhythm as a pattern that structures movement, creating a sense of continuity that extends through the building. The Northern Renaissance introduces variations in how movement is constructed, often emphasizing complexity and multiplicity rather than linear progression. In buildings such as Château de Chambord, movement is not confined to a single axis, but distributed across multiple paths, creating a network of possibilities that require exploration. The central staircase, with its double helix structure, allows multiple routes to intersect without merging, producing a dynamic interaction between occupants and space. The observer must choose a path, and this choice becomes part of the experience, introducing a level of agency that contrasts with the more directed movement of Italian Renaissance architecture. This contrast highlights the flexibility of movement as a system, demonstrating that it can be used to produce different types of spatial experience. In the Italian context, movement often reinforces clarity and order, guiding the observer along predetermined paths that reveal the structure of the building. In the Northern context, movement may introduce complexity and variation, requiring the observer to engage more actively with the space. Both approaches rely on the organization of movement, but they apply it differently, producing distinct perceptual effects. The relationship between movement and scale further complicates this system as changes in magnitude influence how the observer navigates the environment. Large spaces slow movement, encouraging the observer to pause and take in the surroundings, while smaller spaces accelerate movement, creating a sense of progression. The sequence of scales within a building produces a dynamic experience, where the observer's pace and attention are continuously adjusted in response to the dimensions of the space. The integration of movement with symmetry and perspective creates a coordinated system in which each element reinforces the others. Symmetry stabilizes the composition, perspective aligns it with vision, and movement reveals it over time. The observer experiences this integration as a continuous unfolding, where each step confirms the structure of the space, while introducing new relationships. The building becomes a temporal composition, one that is experienced through progression rather than through static observation. As you move through the museum, this structure becomes perceptible through the sequence of spaces, through the alignment of views, through the transitions between different conditions of light, scale, and proportion. The observer becomes aware that their movement is not arbitrary but guided, that the path they follow has been anticipated and shaped by the architecture. The experience of space is revealed as a process, one that unfolds over time and through movement. Movement, therefore, is not an addition to architecture, but a fundamental component of its operation. It is the means through which space is experienced, through which relationships are constructed, through which perception is organized. The building does not simply exist. It directs, guides, and structures the observer's path, creating an experience that is both controlled and dynamic, both predictable and evolving. And within this understanding, movement reveals architecture as a system that operates in time as well as in space, one that constructs not only forms but sequences, not only structures but experiences. The observer becomes part of this system, their movement integrated into the organization of the building, their perception shaped by the paths they follow, the views they encounter, and the transitions they experience. Light in Renaissance architecture functions as a primary ordering mechanism that organizes visibility, hierarchy, and temporal experience through controlled distribution, calibrated intensity, and directional articulation. It is not an additive condition applied to finished form. It is a constitutive variable that determines how form becomes perceptible. Geometry, proportion, and scale remain abstract without illumination. Light converts these abstractions into legible relations by defining edges, producing contrast, and establishing gradients that render depth and volume. The building is therefore constructed as a field of illumination in which apertures, surfaces, and sequences are coordinated to produce a coherent regime of visibility. This regime is neither neutral nor incidental. It is designed. The epistemic dimension of light can be analyzed through the framework of Michel Foucault, where visibility is understood as a condition produced by spatial organization. Light creates fields in which objects become present to perception. Architecture regulates these fields by controlling access to illumination. Apertures are positioned, sized, and oriented to establish what can be seen and when. The distribution of light produces a hierarchy of visibility in which certain elements are emphasized while others are suppressed. This hierarchy is not symbolic alone. It is operational. The observer's attention is directed by brightness, contrast, and orientation. The space is read according to its illumination. The integration of light with proportional systems is explicit in Renaissance design theory. Leon Battista Alberti treats openings as elements subject to the same rules as walls and orders. Their dimensions and positions correspond to ratios that structure the whole. This correspondence ensures that illumination reinforces geometric order rather than disrupting it. In Basilica of San Lorenzo, the alignment of windows with the base system produces a rhythmic distribution of light that coincides with the spacing of columns and arches. The observer perceives the architecture through alternating bands of brightness and shadow that articulate the modular structure. Light does not merely reveal the order, it traces it. The constructive role of light is further clarified by the treatment of surfaces. Illumination requires material to become visible. Different materials produce distinct luminous behaviors. Smooth plaster reflects light evenly, emphasizing planar continuity and geometric clarity. Rusticated stone absorbs and fragments light, producing strong shadow lines that accentuate mass and depth. In Palazzo Medici Riccardi, the gradation from heavily rusticated lower levels to smoother upper courses organizes a vertical hierarchy through light. The base reads as dense and shadowed, the upper levels as refined and illuminated. The perception of weight and stability is constructed through the interaction between material and illumination. The directional control of light establishes orientation within space. Lateral illumination emphasizes depth by projecting shadows across surfaces, revealing relief and articulation. Vertical illumination emphasizes height by reducing lateral contrast and directing attention upward. In St. Peter's Basilica, light entering through the dome produces a vertical field that organizes perception around the crossing. The observer's gaze is guided upward along the axis defined by the dome. This guidance is not symbolic alone. It is perceptual. The brightest zone establishes the focal point. The surrounding architecture is read in relation to this luminous center. The optical logic of light aligns with the perspectival system analyzed by Erwin Panofsky. Perspective constructs a homogeneous field in which relations are organized relative to a viewpoint. Light stabilizes this field by providing consistent cues for depth and distance. Gradients of brightness correspond to recession. Strong contrasts define edges. Repetition of illuminated elements produces continuity along axes. Architecture integrates these cues into physical space. The observer experiences a coordinated system in which visual and spatial relations coincide. The phenomenological account developed by Maurice Merleau-Ponty clarifies how light is encountered as an embodied condition. Perception is not the reception of static images. It is an active engagement with a luminous field that changes with movement. As the observer moves, angles of incidence shift, shadows reconfigure, and surfaces reveal different properties. Light produces a dynamic environment in which perception is continuously updated. The architecture is therefore not fixed in experience. It is reconstituted through changing illumination. Temporal variability is integral to this process. Daylight changes in intensity, color, and direction across hours and seasons. Renaissance buildings are designed to register these changes. Apertures capture low-angle light in the morning and high-angle light at midday. Clear stories introduce diffuse illumination that stabilizes perception when direct light is absent. The observer encounters a sequence of luminous conditions that alter the reading of the same space. Geometry remains constant. Perception varies. This variability is not a defect. It is a designed feature that introduces temporal depth into spatial experience. The distribution of light establishes zones that organize movement and attention. As bright areas attract, dim areas recede. Thresholds are often marked by changes in illumination, signaling transitions between spaces. In longitudinal sequences, increasing brightness can indicate progression toward a focal point. In centralized spaces, concentrated illumination marks the center. The observer navigates according to these cues. Movement is guided without explicit instruction. The building choreographs perception through light. The articulation of openings is central to this choreography. Window size, shape, and placement determine the quality of light. Large apertures admit abundant illumination, but reduce contrast. Smaller apertures produce concentrated beams and sharper shadows. Circular openings distribute light evenly. Rectangular openings emphasize directionality. In the tempietto, the circular plan and controlled apertures produce a balanced distribution of light that reinforces centrality. In basilican plans, clerestory windows create lateral illumination that emphasizes axial depth. The observer reads the spatial organization through these luminous patterns. The relationship between light and structural articulation is evident in the treatment of orders. Columns and pilasters cast shadows that define their profiles. Entablatures produce horizontal shadow lines that stabilize elevations. The repetition of these elements creates a rhythm of light and shadow that extends across the composition. This rhythm is perceptual as well as structural. It guides the eye, reinforces alignment, and produces continuity. The building is read through alternating zones of illumination. The integration of light with color further refines perception. Light does not reveal color uniformly. It alters saturation and value depending on intensity and angle. Frescoes, marbles, and painted surfaces are selected to respond to specific lighting conditions. In interiors, with controlled illumination, color appears stable and saturated. In spaces with variable light, color shifts, producing temporal variation. The observer experiences a chromatic field that changes with movement and time, adding another layer to the perception of space. The Northern Renaissance develops alternative luminous strategies that emphasize diffusion and surface complexity. In Antwerp City Hall, light interacts with articulated facades to produce a finely grained field of highlights and shadows. Illumination is less centralized and more distributed. The observer must attend to detail to construct coherence. This condition contrasts with the Italian preference for directional clarity. The underlying principle remains consistent. Light structures, perception. The method of distribution differs. Interior examples, such as King's College Chapel, demonstrate how large glazed surfaces produce diffuse illumination that reduces strong contrasts while maintaining vertical emphasis. Although Gothic in origin, such environments intersect with Renaissance concerns for clarity and order by producing a continuous luminous field that reveals structural articulation without fragmentation. The observer perceives height and continuity through even illumination, rather than through directional beams. The interaction between light and scale amplifies perceptual effects. Large volumes allow light to disperse, creating gradients that emphasize depth. Small volumes concentrate light, producing stronger contrasts. The observer's perception of magnitude is influenced by these conditions. Bright, evenly lit spaces can appear larger due to the absence of visual boundaries. Strongly contrasted spaces can appear deeper due to pronounced shadow. Scale is therefore mediated by illumination. Acoustics and light operate together in large spaces. Reverberation extends temporal perception, while illumination structures visual perception. In expansive interiors, sound and light both contribute to the experience of magnitude. The observer perceives a space that extends beyond immediate grasp through multiple sensory channels. This integration reinforces the perception of scale and coherence. The regulation of light also constructs symbolic hierarchies. In ecclesiastical settings, illumination often concentrates on altars, domes, or relics. These areas become visual centers. The observer's attention is drawn to them through brightness. Secondary areas remain less illuminated, establishing a hierarchy of importance. This hierarchy is perceived directly through light rather than inferred through iconography alone. Light communicates value. The coordination of light with symmetry and axis strengthens this hierarchy. Symmetrical arrangements distribute illumination evenly across corresponding elements, reinforcing balance. Axial alignments concentrate light along lines of movement, guiding perception toward focal points. The combined system produces a stable and directed visual field. The observer experiences clarity because illumination aligns with geometry. The invisibility of these operations is essential. The observer does not perceive ratios or calculations. They perceive brightness, contrast, and direction. The system withdraws behind its effects. Light appears natural, even when it is precisely controlled. This concealment allows architecture to guide perception without appearing to do so. The diagrammatic role of light can be understood as a projection of geometric order into perceptual space. Plans and sections define the placement of openings. The realized building converts these placements into luminous patterns that can be experienced. The diagram becomes a field of illumination. The observer reads the diagram through light. The temporal sequencing of light can be used to mark ritual or programmatic events. Specific times of day produce specific illuminations of key elements. Openings are oriented to capture sunlight at particular angles. The building becomes a device that registers time through light. The observer experiences temporal cycles as changes in visibility. The integration of artificial light in later adaptations continues these principles by replicating or extending natural illumination patterns. Although not original to the Renaissance, the logic remains consistent. Light is organized to reinforce geometry, hierarchy, and movement. The medium changes. The structure persists. As movement continues through the museum, the operation of light becomes legible through its effects. Bright zones draw attention. Shadow defines depth. Transitions in illumination signal changes in space. The observer recognizes that visibility is constructed. Space is not simply seen, it is revealed. Light, therefore, functions as a structural language. It encodes relations, directs attention, and organizes perception across time. It integrates with geometry, proportion, scale, and movement to produce a coherent field. The experience of architecture is inseparable from the experience of illumination. The building is not only a configuration of materials, it is a configuration of light. The facade in Renaissance architecture is not a surface that simply encloses a building or presents its exterior to the street. It is a constructed image, a deliberate composition that mediates between interior order and public perception. It does not reveal the building as it is. It presents the building as it should be understood. The facade, therefore, operates at the intersection of architecture and representation, where geometry, proportion, and ornament are organized to produce meaning before one even enters the space. It is the first encounter, but it is not neutral. It frames expectation, directs interpretation, and constructs a relationship between the building and its observer that is already structured before any movement through the interior begins. This condition reflects a broader transformation in Renaissance thought, where representation becomes a central mechanism for organizing knowledge and experience. The analysis of Michel Foucault identifies the emergence of systems in which surfaces and signs are used to construct intelligibility, where what is seen is arranged to communicate order, hierarchy, and meaning. The facade participates in this system by functioning as a surface that encodes the building's logic into a visual language. It translates the abstract principles of proportion and geometry into an image that can be read immediately, even by an observer who does not enter the building. The relationship between facade and representation can also be understood through the concept of decorum articulated by Leon Battista Alberti, who emphasizes that architectural elements must correspond to the status, function, and meaning of the building. The facade becomes the site where this correspondence is made visible. It is where the building declares what it is, not through explicit statements, but through the organization of form. Columns, pilasters, pediments, and openings are arranged to produce a coherent image that aligns with the building's purpose and the expectations of its context. In this sense, the facade is not a passive reflection of the interior. It is an active construction that may align with or diverge from the internal organization. The building presents itself outwardly through a system that is designed to communicate clarity, even when the interior is more complex. The observer encounters the facade as a unified composition, one that appears stable and complete, regardless of the variations that may exist behind it. This distinction is evident in the facade of Palazzo Rucellai, where Alberti applies a system of superimposed classical orders to organize the exterior into a coherent grid. The facade is structured through horizontal divisions and vertical pilasters that create a sense of regularity and proportion. The interior of the palace, however, is not strictly aligned with this system. Rooms vary in size and function, reflecting practical considerations that are not immediately visible from the exterior. The facade, therefore, operates as a representation of order, rather than a direct expression of internal arrangement. It constructs an image of stability and refinement that communicates the status of the family and their alignment with classical ideals. The facade's role as representation becomes even more pronounced in religious architecture, where it functions as a threshold between the secular and the sacred. In the facade of Santa Maria Novella, Alberti integrates existing Gothic elements into a new composition that employs geometric forms and proportional relationships to produce unity. The use of a large central pediment, flanked by volutes that connect the upper and lower sections, creates a visual hierarchy that directs attention toward the center. The facade does not simply cover the church. It redefines its identity, presenting it as a coherent and rational structure that aligns with Renaissance ideals. This act of redefinition demonstrates that the facade can transform the perception of a building without altering its underlying structure. The observer encounters the facade as the primary image of the building, interpreting its meaning through the organization of its surface. The interior becomes secondary in the initial encounter, as the facade establishes the framework through which the building is understood. The relationship between facade and perception is closely linked to the development of perspective, as analyzed by Erwin Panofsky, who describes perspective as a symbolic form that organizes visual experience according to a unified system. The facade operates within this framework by presenting a composition that can be read from a specific viewpoint, often aligned with the street or the approach to the building. The arrangement of elements is designed to produce a balanced and intelligible image, one that appears coherent when viewed from the intended position. This alignment between facade and viewpoint reinforces the idea that architecture is constructed in relation to the observer. The facade is not only a physical surface, it is a visual field that is organized to produce a particular experience. the observer's position is anticipated, and the composition is structured to guide perception from that position. The building, therefore, extends beyond its material boundaries, shaping how it is seen and understood within its environment. The urban context plays a significant role in this process, as facades interact with streets, squares, and neighbouring buildings to create a continuous visual field. In Palazzo Medici Riccardi, the facade establishes a strong horizontal emphasis through the use of rusticated stone at the lower levels and smoother surfaces above. This gradation creates a sense of weight and stability, grounding the building within the street, while presenting a refined appearance at higher levels. The facade contributes to the overall character of the urban environment, reinforcing a sense of order that extends beyond the individual building. The concept of representation also involves the communication of power, as facades often serve as symbols of authority and identity. In civic buildings, such as Palazzo Vecchio, the facade conveys strength and permanence through its massive stone construction and minimal ornamentation. The building's appearance reflects its function as a center of governance, projecting an image of stability and control. The observer encounters the facade as a statement of institutional power, one that is constructed through the organization of form. The relationship between facade and power can be further analyzed through the work of Louis Marin, who examines how images function as representations of authority. The facade operates as such an image, presenting a version of the building that embodies its intended meaning. This representation is not neutral. It is constructed to produce a specific effect, aligning perception with the values and objectives of the building's patron. In the case of religious architecture, this alignment often involves the use of light and ornament to emphasize certain elements of the facade. The central portal, for example, is frequently highlighted through decoration and proportion, drawing attention to the entrance as a point of transition. The observer's movement is guided by this emphasis, as the facade directs attention toward the place where the exterior gives way to the interior. The building thus uses its surface to choreograph the initial stages of experience. The Northern Renaissance introduces variations in how facades operate as representations, often incorporating more intricate ornamentation and a greater emphasis on verticality. In Antwerp City Hall, the facade combines classical elements with local traditions, producing a composition that reflects the civic identity of the city. The building's surface is more elaborate, requiring the observer to engage with detail as well as overall structure. This approach demonstrates that representation can be constructed through complexity as well as clarity, depending on the cultural context. The facade also plays a role in mediating between architecture and time, as it is often the most visible and enduring part of a building. Changes to the facade can alter the perception of the building without affecting its internal structure, allowing it to adapt to new contexts while preserving its core. This adaptability reinforces the facade's role as a representation, one that can be modified to reflect changing meanings and values. The distinction between facade and structure becomes particularly evident in buildings where the exterior presents a different order than the interior. The facade may impose symmetry and regularity, while the interior accommodates irregular functions and spaces. This divergence highlights the facade's role as an independent layer of meaning, one that operates alongside but not identical to the building's internal organization. The observer's experience of the facade is therefore both immediate and constructed. It appears as a coherent image that can be grasped at a glance, yet this coherence is the result of deliberate design decisions that organize form, proportion, and ornament into a unified system. The facade does not simply exist, it is composed. As you move through the museum, this compositional logic becomes apparent in the way buildings present themselves to the viewer, in the alignment of elements, in the balance of proportions, in the interplay of light and shadow across surfaces. The facade reveals itself as a surface that is designed to be read, a visual language that communicates order and meaning through its arrangement. The recognition of the facade as representation transforms the understanding of architecture, revealing that what appears as a simple exterior is in fact a complex system of signs that shape perception before any movement through space occurs. The building is encountered first as an image, and this image establishes the framework through which the rest of the experience is understood. And within this framework, architecture operates not only as a physical structure, but as a medium of representation, one that constructs meaning through surfaces, organizes perception through composition, and positions the observer within a system that extends beyond the material boundaries of the building. Renaissance architecture establishes the plan as a primary instrument of knowledge, a diagrammatic construct that organizes space through geometry, proportion, and alignment before material realization. The plan is not a descriptive record, but a generative system. It precedes construction and governs it. In this sense, architecture becomes an intellectual discipline in which spatial order is first resolved in abstraction and then translated into material form. The tension between the ideal plan and the built reality arises from the difference between these two domains. The plan operates within a field of perfect relations, while the building must accommodate structural constraints, site conditions, and functional requirements. This difference is not incidental. It defines the operation of Renaissance architecture. The conceptual status of the plan is articulated with precision by Leon Battista Alberti, who distinguishes between lineaments and construction. Lineaments are the abstract relations that define the building. They exist independently of material. Construction is the process through which these relations are realized. The plan belongs to lineaments. It establishes the order of the building without reference to its physical substance. This separation introduces a hierarchy in which the abstract system governs the material outcome. The building is expected to conform to the logic of the plan, preserving its proportional and geometric coherence. This hierarchy reflects a broader epistemic transformation that can be analyzed through Michel Foucault. Renaissance knowledge organizes reality through representation, classification, and measurable relations. The plan participates in this transformation by converting spatial complexity into a system of geometric operations. It reduces the variability of material conditions to a set of controlled relations that can be manipulated and reproduced. Architecture becomes a discipline of representation. The building becomes an instance of a general system. The geometric forms employed in ideal plans are not arbitrary. Circles, squares, and centralized compositions are selected for their capacity to produce complete and self-consistent systems. In the Tempietto by Donato Bramante, the circular plan establishes a condition of total symmetry. Every point on the perimeter is equidistant from the center. The relation between parts is uniform. The observer can infer the whole from any position. The plan achieves closure. It defines a space that is conceptually complete. Centralized plans embody the ideal of unity. They eliminate directional hierarchy and distribute relations evenly. This distribution aligns with the harmonic interpretation of proportion analyzed by Rudolf Wittgauer, where ratios derived from musical consonances produce coherence. In centralized compositions, these ratios organize the entire structure. The plan becomes a harmonic system in which each part corresponds to the others through measurable relations. The building is conceived as a totality. The translation of these ideal systems into built form introduces constraints that disrupt geometric purity. Structural requirements impose limits on spans and heights. Materials resist perfect continuity. Sites introduce irregular boundaries. Programs require differentiated spaces. The construction of St. Peter's Basilica exemplifies this condition. The original centralized plan proposed by Bramante was modified by subsequent architects, including Michelangelo Buonarroti, and collo moderno to incorporate a longitudinal nave. The final building integrates central and axial systems. The ideal of geometric unity is preserved in the dome and crossing, while functional requirements introduce directional hierarchy. The building is not a direct realization of a single plan. It is a composite of competing systems. This composite condition reveals that the plan operates as a guiding principle rather than a fixed template. It establishes relations that persist even when the configuration changes. The dome retains centrality. The proportions of the crossing maintain harmonic coherence. The longitudinal addition does not eliminate the original system, it overlays it. The building becomes a site of negotiation between ideal and necessity. The work of Andrea Palladio demonstrates a different mode of this negotiation. Palladio's villas translate centralized and symmetrical plans into domestic architecture while accommodating site and program. In Villa Rotonda, the plan is organized around a central hall with 4 identical porticos. The building adapts to the topography of the site, adjusting levels and approaches while maintaining geometric coherence. The plan operates as a flexible schema. It allows the variation without losing identity. The building preserves the logic of the plan while responding to external conditions. The role of drawing is critical in mediating between plan and construction. Drawings translate geometric relations into measurable instructions. They specify dimensions, alignments, and proportions. However, they cannot fully anticipate material behavior. Construction introduces variables such as tolerances, deformations, and adaptations that alter the realization. The building is therefore not a direct transcription of the drawing. It is an interpretation. The plan remains present as an underlying structure, but its manifestation is modified. The perspectival analysis of Erwin Panofsky clarifies how this underlying structure is perceived. Perspective organizes space as a coherent field relative to a viewpoint. Architectural plans align with this logic by establishing axes and symmetries that produce stable visual relations. However, the observer does not perceive the plan directly. The plan must be reconstructed through movement. The building presents partial views that must be integrated into a whole. The ideal exists as a latent structure within experience. The phenomenological account developed by Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasizes this process of reconstruction. Perception is embodied and temporal. The observer encounters space through sequences. The coherence of the plan is not given at once. It emerges through movement. The observer constructs the system by relating successive views. The ideal plan becomes an experiential construct rather than an immediate image. This distinction between conceptual and experiential order is evident in longitudinal buildings. In the Basilica of San Lorenzo, the modular system of bays establishes a clear proportional structure and plan. The observer, however, experiences this structure through progression. Each bay confirms the system while extending it. The whole is understood through accumulation. The plan exists as a continuous relation. The experience is sequential. Northern Renaissance architecture introduces further complexity by distributing order across multiple systems rather than concentrating it in a single geometric figure. In Château de Chambord, the plan incorporates a central core, multiple staircases, and irregular extensions. The composition resists reduction to a single diagram. Order is present, but it is layered. The observer must navigate and compare different parts to construct coherence. The ideal is not absent, it is fragmented. This fragmentation reflects a different relation between abstraction and materiality. The plan does not dominate the building, it interacts with it. The building accumulates elements over time. Additions, modifications, and local conditions shape the final form. The result is a complex system that cannot be fully captured by a single plan. The observer encounters variability rather than closure. The relation between plan and function further complicates this dynamic. Ideal plans often prioritize geometric clarity over practical use. Circulation, access, and accommodation require adjustments that introduce asymmetry or irregularity. In palatial architecture, enfilades align rooms along axes, but service spaces and circulation routes introduce deviations. The plan balances representational order with operational requirements. The building must function as well as signify. The integration of multiple constraints produces hybrid conditions in which different systems coexist. Centralized and longitudinal plans are combined. Symmetrical facades conceal asymmetrical interiors. Regular grids are adapted to irregular sites. The building becomes a layered construct in which ideal relations persist within modified configurations. The observer perceives coherence at the level of representation, while complexity operates beneath it. Urban contexts extend these dynamics to a larger scale. In Piazza del Campidoglio, designed by Michelangelo Buonarroti, the plan imposes a trapezoidal geometry on an irregular site. The facades are aligned to create a coherent spatial field. The paving pattern reinforces the geometry. The ideal plan organizes perception, despite the constraints of the site. The observer experiences a unified space that conceals its irregular origins. The persistence of the ideal within built reality demonstrates that the plan functions as a regulating principle rather than a literal template. It establishes relations that guide construction and perception. These relations can be modified, combined, or extended without losing their identity. The building becomes a negotiation between abstraction and materiality. The epistemic significance of this negotiation lies in the separation between concept and execution. Architecture is no longer defined by craft alone. It is defined by design. The plan embodies knowledge. The building embodies its application. The observer engages with both levels simultaneously, perceiving the effects of the plan while experiencing the conditions of the building. As movement continues through the museum, this duality becomes perceptible through the contrast between apparent order and underlying complexity. Some spaces present themselves as complete systems. Others reveal adjustments, deviations, and layers. The observer recognizes that coherence is constructed. It is not given by material alone. It is produced through the interaction between ideal and reality. The plan, therefore, operates as a language that encodes spatial relations, while the building translates that language into experience. The translation is not exact. It involves interpretation, adaptation, and transformation. The tension between these processes defines the character of Renaissance architecture. This tension does not undermine the system, it sustains it. The ideal provides a framework for order. The built reality introduces variability. The observer perceives both. The experience of architecture emerges from their interaction, from the continuous negotiation between what is conceived and what is realized, between the diagram and the space, between the abstract and the material. Renaissance architecture operates within an institutional matrix in which patronage determines not only the existence of buildings, but the conditions of their form, their placement, their visibility, and their interpretation. Architecture is inseparable from the systems that finance, authorize, and legitimize it. The building is not an autonomous artifact. It is the materialization of coordinated decisions that originate in structures of power. These structures do not function only at the level of political control or economic capacity. They operate through representation, through the organization of perception, through the production of environments that render authority visible and intelligible. The experience of architectural order is therefore inseparable from the experience of power. The analytic framework of Michel Foucault provides a precise account of how power operates through spatial organization. Power is not a centralized possession. It is a network of relations that produces knowledge, visibility, and behavior. Architecture participates in this network by constructing fields in which subjects are positioned, oriented, and regulated. The arrangement of space determines what can be seen, where bodies can move, and how interactions occur. Visibility is not neutral, it is produced. The distribution of light, the alignment of axes, and the hierarchy of spaces create regimes of perception that correspond to regimes of authority. The building becomes an apparatus that organizes experience according to institutional priorities. Within the Renaissance, three principal forms of patronage structure: architectural production, ecclesiastical patronage, civic patronage, and aristocratic patronage operate with distinct objectives, but share a common reliance on architecture as a medium of representation and control. Each form establishes a different relation between space and authority, yet all depend on the capacity of architecture to produce coherence that appears natural and self-evident. Ecclesiastical patronage constructs environments in which spatial order corresponds to theological hierarchy. In St. Peter's Basilica, the integration of scale, symmetry, and illumination produces a spatial field that exceeds the body while maintaining intelligibility through proportion. The observer is positioned within a system that directs attention toward the altar and the dome. This direction is not enforced through explicit instruction. It is achieved through the organization of space. The brightest and most elevated zones become focal points. Movement is oriented toward them. The observer experiences a hierarchy that is both spatial and institutional. The building does not represent authority. It enacts it. The theoretical articulation of this relation between form and authority can be extended through the analysis of representation. Louis Marin identifies representation as a process that produces presence through absence. Authority is made visible through signs that stand in for it. Architecture functions as one of these signs. It constructs an image of power that can be perceived and interpreted. The facade, the dome, the monumental axis operate as representational devices. They present authority as stable, ordered, and continuous. The observer encounters not the institution itself, but its spatial manifestation. Civic patronage extends these principles to the scale of the city, organizing public space as a field in which authority is distributed and perceived collectively. In Piazza del Campidoglio, redesigned by Michelangelo Buonarroti, the irregular topography is reorganized through a trapezoidal plan that aligns facades and directs movement toward the central axis. The paving pattern reinforces this geometry, producing a coherent field that organizes perception. The observer experiences a unified space that conceals its irregular origins. Authority is constructed through the imposition of order on complexity. The city becomes legible as a system. The articulation of civic authority through architecture can also be analyzed through the work of Henri Lefebvre, who defines space as socially produced. Space is not a neutral container. It is constructed through practices that reflect and reinforce social relations. Renaissance urban design exemplifies this production by organizing streets, squares, and buildings into coordinated systems that structure interaction. The placement of government buildings, the alignment of processional routes, and the configuration of public squares create environments in which authority is both visible and experienced. The observer participates in this system through movement, encountering architecture as a sequence of controlled relations. Aristocratic patronage operates at the scale of the palace and the villa, where architecture constructs social identity through the display of order and refinement. In Palazzo Rucellai, designed by Leon Battista Alberti, the facade employs superimposed orders and proportional systems that align the building with classical antiquity. The use of these elements is not decorative, it is strategic. It positions the patron within a lineage of cultural authority. The building communicates intellectual and social status through its adherence to recognized systems of order. The observer reads this order as a sign of legitimacy. The villa, as developed by Andrea Palladio, extends this logic into the landscape, integrating architecture with agricultural and territorial control. In Villa Rotonda, the centralized plan and symmetrical facades establish a condition of balance that extends outward into the surrounding environment. The building becomes a point of orientation within the landscape, organizing views and movement. The patron's authority is inscribed not only in the building, but in the territory it structures. Architecture becomes a tool for managing both space and perception at multiple scales. The economic dimension of patronage underlies these operations, as the ability to commission architecture depends on access to resources. Wealth is converted into form. Materials, labor, and design expertise are mobilized to produce buildings that embody economic power. The visible order of architecture conceals the processes of accumulation and expenditure that make it possible. The building appears as a stable object, while the economic relations that produce it remain implicit. The relation between architecture and labor introduces another layer of complexity. Construction involves craftsmen, engineers, and workers, whose contributions are integrated into the final form, but not represented within it. The building presents itself as a unified object, masking the multiplicity of processes and participants involved in its production. This concealment reinforces the authority of the patron by presenting the building as a coherent expression of a singular will. The negotiation between architect and patron shapes the design process, producing buildings that reflect both conceptual frameworks and institutional objectives. Architects develop systems of proportion and geometry that provide coherence, while patrons impose requirements related to function, representation, and context. The resulting architecture is a synthesis of these factors. It embodies theoretical principles while responding to practical constraints. The coherence of the building depends on the integration of these elements. The work of Donato Bramante demonstrates how architectural innovation can align with institutional ambition. In the design of centralized plans for ecclesiastical buildings, Bramante articulates a vision of unity that corresponds to the authority of the Church. The geometry of the plan expresses a theological ideal, while the scale of the building asserts institutional presence. The architecture operates simultaneously as a conceptual system and as a representation of power. The performative dimension of architecture becomes evident in public rituals and ceremonies that take place within design spaces. Processions, gatherings, and liturgical events are structured by the configuration of architecture. Axes guide movement, plazas accommodate crowds, and facades provide backdrops that frame action. The observer experiences these events within a spatial system that amplifies their significance. Architecture functions as a stage on which authority is enacted. The concept of spectacle provides a framework for understanding this function. Guy Debord defines spectacle as a system in which social relations are mediated through images. Architecture contributes to this system by producing images of order and power that are experienced collectively. The facade, the dome, the plaza become visual constructs that represent authority. The observer engages with these constructs as part of a shared perception, reinforcing their legitimacy. The Northern Renaissance introduces variations in patronage that reflect different social and economic conditions. In Antwerp City Hall, the building expresses civic authority within a commercial context. The facade integrates classical elements with local traditions, producing a hybrid language that reflects the city's identity. Authority is distributed across institutions rather than concentrated in a single patron. The architecture represents a collective system of governance shaped by trade and urban development. In Château de Chambord, royal patronage produces a complex architectural composition that integrates symbolic representation with functional requirements. The building's scale and ornament communicate the power of the monarchy, while its internal organization accommodates courtly life. the observer encounters a structure that combines multiple systems of order, reflecting the complexity of its patronage. The relation between architecture and power is further complicated by the role of ideology, where buildings embody values and beliefs that extend beyond immediate function. Classical forms are associated with rationality and order. Symmetry is associated with balance and stability. Monumentality is associated with authority. These associations are not inherent. They are constructed through cultural practice. Architecture reinforces them by presenting these forms within coherent systems that appear natural. The invisibility of these constructions is essential to their effectiveness. The observer perceives order without perceiving the processes that produce it. The building appears self-evident. Its coherence is accepted as given. This acceptance allows architecture to function as a stable representation of authority, one that does not reveal its underlying conditions. The integration of architecture into systems of power extends to the organization of interior space, where access and movement are regulated according to hierarchy. Public areas are distinguished from private ones. Circulation paths separate different groups. The observer's experience is structured by these distinctions, positioning them within a network of relations that reflects institutional priorities. Space becomes a medium through which social order is enacted. As movement continues through the museum, these dynamics become perceptible through the arrangement of galleries, the placement of objects, and the control of circulation. Certain areas are emphasized, others are secondary. The sequence of spaces guides the observer through a curated experience that reflects the institution's values. The architecture of the museum continues the Renaissance project of organizing perception, extending its principles into contemporary contexts. The recognition of patronage as a structural condition of architecture transforms the understanding of space, revealing that buildings are not neutral environments, but products of coordinated systems of power, knowledge, and representation. The coherence that architecture produces is not an inherent quality. It is constructed through the alignment of design with institutional objectives. Architecture therefore operates as a medium that integrates form, perception, and authority into a unified system. The building is both an object and a process, both a representation and an instrument. It constructs environments in which power is experienced, not as an abstract concept, but as a condition embedded in space. And within this understanding, the observer becomes aware that the spaces they inhabit are structured by forces that extend beyond immediate perception, that the order they experience is produced through systems that remain implicit, and that architecture, in its apparent stability, is an active participant in the construction of authority. There is a particular kind of space that does not call attention to itself. It does not overwhelm. It does not confuse. It does not demand interpretation. It feels calm, stable, and correct. It presents itself as if it has always been this way, as if no decision was required for it to exist, as if its order is not imposed, but simply inherent. This is the space that appears neutral. It is the most persuasive space, because it hides its own construction. It does not feel designed. It feels inevitable. The Renaissance is the moment when this kind of space becomes fully possible, not because architects suddenly discovered harmony, but because they learned how to construct environments that conceal the operations that produce them. What appears neutral is not the absence of intention. It is the successful masking of intention. The more controlled a space is, the less it appears to be controlled. The more carefully it is organized, the more it appears natural. This is the paradox at the center of Renaissance architecture. Order does not present itself as order. It presents itself as truth. This condition reflects a deeper transformation in how knowledge and perception are structured. The analysis of Michel Foucault identifies the emergence of systems in which power operates not through visible force, but through organization, classification, and normalization. Space becomes one of the mediums through which this organization takes place. It shapes behavior, not by restricting movement directly, but by guiding it in ways that appear self-evident. The individual does not feel controlled. They feel oriented. Renaissance architecture constructs this orientation through proportion, symmetry, alignment, and clarity. These elements are not neutral in themselves. They are techniques. They produce a condition in which the observer can immediately understand how to occupy the space, where to stand, where to move, where to look. The space feels intuitive, but this intuition is not natural. It is learned through repeated exposure to environments that are structured in this way. The Renaissance does not invent human perception, but it organizes it into a system that can be reproduced. The role of proportion in this process is central. The work of Rudolf Virchow demonstrates how Renaissance architects used mathematical ratios to create relationships between parts that produce a sense of harmony. These ratios are not perceived as numbers. They are experienced as balance. The observer does not calculate the relationship between width and height. They feel that the space is correct. This feeling is the result of a system that operates below the level of conscious awareness. In a church such as San Lorenzo, the repetition of columns, the regular spacing of arches, and the consistent proportions of bays create a rhythm that stabilizes perception. The observer moves through a sequence that is predictable, where each part relates to the next in a way that can be anticipated. This predictability produces a sense of calm. It appears neutral because it does not resist comprehension. But this neutrality is constructed through exclusion as much as inclusion. Irregularity, asymmetry, and unpredictability are minimized or concealed. The space is edited to remove elements that would disrupt its coherence. What remains is not a natural environment, but a curated one. The observer encounters a version of space that has been refined to produce a specific effect. The concept of neutrality also depends on the alignment between space and the body. Renaissance architecture often employs proportions that relate to human scale, creating environments that feel neither overwhelming nor constraining. This alignment produces comfort, but it also reinforces a particular understanding of how space should relate to the human subject. The body becomes the measure, but this measure is itself constructed. It reflects an idealized conception of the human figure, one that is derived from classical sources and applied universally. The influence of Vitruvius is evident here, particularly in the idea that the proportions of the human body can serve as a model for architectural design. This idea suggests that harmony in architecture is analogous to harmony in the body, creating a correspondence between the observer and the environment. The space feels natural because it reflects a structure that is already familiar. But this familiarity is not inherent. It is mediated through cultural and historical frameworks that define what counts as proportionate and harmonious. The appearance of neutrality is also reinforced through the use of light. Light reveals structure without drawing attention to itself. It defines surfaces, emphasizes proportions, and guides perception in ways that are subtle and continuous. In Renaissance interiors, light is often distributed evenly, avoiding dramatic contrasts that would disrupt the sense of stability. The observer experiences the space as clear and legible, where nothing is hidden and everything can be understood at a glance. This clarity contributes to the illusion that the space is transparent, that it does not intervene in perception, but simply allows it to occur. In reality, space is actively shaping what is seen and how it is interpreted. The observer's gaze is directed, their movement is guided, their attention is focused. The space appears neutral because its operations are integrated into the experience so seamlessly that they are not perceived as operations. The facade, which has already been examined as a site of representation, also plays a role in establishing this neutrality. By presenting a coherent and balanced exterior, it prepares the observer for an interior that will align with these expectations. The transition from outside to inside reinforces the sense that the building is consistent and stable, that its order is not imposed, but inherent. The work of Erwin Panofsky provides insight into how this coherence is related to the development of perspective, which organizes visual experience into a unified field. Perspective constructs a space in which all elements are related to a single viewpoint, producing a sense of order that appears objective. Renaissance architecture aligns with this system by creating environments that can be understood from specific positions, where the arrangement of elements produces a coherent image. This alignment between architectural space and perspectival vision reinforces the perception of neutrality. The observer feels that they are seeing the space as it is, not as it has been constructed. The viewpoint appears natural, even though it has been designed. The space does not reveal its dependence on a particular position. It presents itself as universally intelligible. The Northern Renaissance introduces variations in how neutrality is constructed, often incorporating more complexity and ornament, while still maintaining underlying systems of order. In buildings such as Antwerp City Hall, the facade may appear more elaborate, but the organization of elements still produces a coherent structure that can be understood as a whole. The observer engages with detail, but the overall system remains stable. The persistence of this constructed neutrality extends beyond the Renaissance into later architectural developments, influencing how space is designed and experienced in different contexts. The principles established during this period continue to shape environments that are perceived as normal, natural, and unremarkable. The space that appears neutral becomes the standard against which other spaces are measured. The recognition of this condition changes how space is understood. What appears natural is revealed to be constructed. What feels intuitive is shown to be designed. The observer becomes aware that their experience of space is not simply a reflection of the environment, but the result of systems that have been developed to guide perception. This awareness does not eliminate the effect of neutrality. The space continues to operate as before, producing calm, clarity, and stability. But it introduces a new dimension to the experience, one in which the observer can perceive the underlying structures that shape their perception. The space is no longer invisible. It becomes visible as a system. And within this recognition, architecture reveals itself not as a passive container, but as an active medium that constructs how space is understood, shaping perception in ways that are subtle, continuous, and deeply embedded in the experience of the world. When you leave the museum, nothing appears to follow you. The walls remain where they are. The domes do not move. The corridors return to silence. Architecture seems fixed, contained within its own boundaries, separated from the life that continues outside. And yet, something has already shifted, not in the buildings, but in the way they have been understood. What once appeared as structure now reveals itself as a system. What once felt natural now carries the trace of construction. The experience does not end at the threshold, because architecture was never confined to the building alone. It has always extended into perception. Throughout this journey, architecture has unfolded not as a sequence of styles or monuments, but as a series of decisions about how space should be organized, how it should be seen, and how it should be experienced. Each column, each axis, each proportion, each alignment has participated in a larger structure that exists beneath the visible surface. These structures are not immediately apparent. They do not announce themselves. They operate quietly, shaping the conditions through which space becomes intelligible. The Renaissance marks the moment when these conditions become deliberate. Space is no longer assembled through habit or necessity alone. It is constructed through systems that anticipate perception. The architect does not simply build. The architect organizes how space will be understood before it is encountered. This organization produces environments that appear stable, balanced, and inevitable. Yet this appearance is the result of careful design. The space feels neutral because its operations are concealed. What has emerged across these chapters is not a single principle, but a network of relationships. Geometry establishes structure. Perspective positions the observer. Symmetry stabilizes perception. Scale produces authority. Movement guides experience. Light reveals and conceals. The facade communicates before entry. And beneath all of these, there remains the persistent condition that the most powerful spaces are those that do not appear to be constructed at all. This is where architecture becomes most effective, not when it overwhelms, but when it disappears into the experience it creates. The observer does not feel directed, yet they move along paths that have been defined. They do not feel positioned, yet their viewpoint has been anticipated. They do not feel persuaded, yet their perception aligns with the logic of the space. Architecture operates at a level that is both visible and invisible, present and concealed. The theoretical frameworks that have accompanied this journey help clarify this condition, but they do not exhaust it. The work of Erwin Panofsky reveals how perspective constructs a world that appears coherent from a fixed point, transforming vision into a structured system. The analysis of Rudolf Wittgauer demonstrates how proportion produces harmony through mathematical relations that are felt rather than calculated. The reflections of Michel Foucault show how systems of order operate through normalization, shaping behavior without requiring direct force. These ideas do not exist outside architecture. They are embedded within it, shaping how space is conceived and experienced. And yet, even with this understanding, architecture does not lose its effect. The calm of a well-proportioned interior remains. The clarity of a symmetrical facade persists. The sense of stability within a balanced space continues to be felt. Knowledge does not dissolve experience. It deepens it. The space becomes layered, containing both its immediate presence and the systems that produce it. This dual awareness is what remains after the museum. The recognition that space is never simply given. It is always constructed, not only through materials, but through relationships that organize how those materials are perceived. The world begins to shift in subtle ways. Corridors reveal their direction. Openings reveal their alignment. Light reveals its intention. What once appeared incidental begins to appear deliberate. This does not require a specialized setting. It extends into everyday environments. The layout of a room, the spacing of buildings along a street, the rhythm of windows, the positioning of entrances. These are not arbitrary. They participate in the same processes that shaped Renaissance architecture. The difference is not in the presence of design, but in the visibility of its effects. Some spaces make their structure apparent, others conceal it, but all spaces are constructed. The Renaissance does not remain confined to its historical moment. It establishes a way of thinking that continues to inform how space is organized. The idea that architecture can construct perception, that it can guide experience through systems that are both precise and invisible, persists across time. It becomes part of the background of how environments are designed and understood. And this is where the final shift occurs. The recognition that architecture is not something separate from perception, but something that shapes it continuously. The observer is not outside the system. They are within it. Every movement, every glance, every sense of orientation is influenced by the structures that surround them. There is no final moment where this process ends, no single point where architecture reveals itself completely. It remains partial, unfolding through experience, through attention, through awareness. What changes is not the space, but the way it is seen. And once this shift has occurred, it cannot be reversed. you begin to notice. The alignment of a hallway that directs you forward without instruction. The proportion of a room that feels calm without explanation. The symmetry of a facade that appears balanced without effort. The light that reveals structure without announcing itself. These moments accumulate, forming a new understanding of space as something that is never neutral, never accidental, never without intention. Architecture remains where it has always been, but now it is no longer invisible.